Good morning. Thank you for coming. This is the second day of this year's Star Symposium about the rise of authoritarianism and U.S.-Japan relations. I'm Hiroshi Takeuchi. I'm director of Star program on Japan and East Asia in the SMU Tower Center. As I said in the program, this symposium is motivated by the current world situation. So we are living in what I would call the leaderless international order. And this is actually also called Professor Satoru Mori of Keio University, who was one of the panelists of last year's Star Symposium in Tokyo. He calls the current world as post-primacy, which I agree with. When I wrote the short article for Business Journal in Japan a few months ago, I call the current world the leaderless international order. The editor immediately told me that he was looking forward to the new leader of the international order soon in November. I didn't mean that. I meant that whoever is elected as a US president in the post-primacy world, we are living in the leaderless international order. So the questions are threefold. One, what kind of leadership roles Japan is expected to play in this tumultuous post-primacy world with a high degree of political uncertainty? Secondly, how do various issues such as security, economy, and businesses interact with each other, and then how should the United States and Japan cooperate to solve the problems facing US and Japan in a rapidly changing strategic environment? Yesterday, I asked Dr. Solis what issue areas are more promising. Well, basically, we cannot do everything. We can do anything, but we cannot do everything. So her answer was 1, deterrence, 2, economic security, and then 3, managing China, or so-called the China challenge. By the way, the China challenge is originally the concept proposed by Dr. Christensen of currently the Columbia University, and he was the keynote speaker of the Star Symposium several years ago. And so that's the so-called the China challenge. And the third, how does each country's domestic politics affect the government's foreign policy, while changing the dynamic of conflict and cooperation in international relations? One issue area, of course, is Taiwan. And Jim last night asked that question, kind of like inserted the last question after all the questions we have discussed. And so I usually say that China is different from Russia, Taiwan is different from Ukraine, and Xi Jinping is different from Putin. So overall, Taiwan issue is not as bad as the issue in Ukraine. Taiwan invasion, China's invasion of Taiwan is much less likely, actually quite unlikely. Having said that, I have heard like 3 concerning comments from the experts. One, most of the China experts say that, yes, that is the case. So it's unlikely. It doesn't make sense for China to invade Taiwan. It will not be a rational decision, and which I overall agree with. However, secondly, some of the Chinese specialists still raise concern, saying that Xi Jinping is different. So he is serious about his goal of unifying Taiwan. And their argument is, as long as there is an opportunity, Xi Jinping will take the opportunity to invade Taiwan and unify Taiwan. Well, so we have to prevent that kind of opportunity to rise. So the answer is deterrence. So the third group of experts says that this is an expert of U.S. Japan relations. And then they were actually informally doing a simulation about what to do and what would happen if Taiwan Straits crisis happens. And there is a consensus of those, like the result of those simulations. That is, well, US will eventually win if US intervenes. However, with one condition, that is Japan cooperates with the United States. So with the logic of deterrence, what is important is China and China's leadership believes that deterrence is working, then deterrence will work. And then in order for deterrence to work, what is important is Japan will cooperate with the United States. And then the next question is how? And then there is a wide range of the discussion. And the one thing that might make deterrence work is Japan let the United States, Japan allows the United States to use various facilities in Japan when Taiwan Strait crisis happens. And one scenario is, well, if China controls the air zone of Taiwan Strait, then Taiwan military has to move all the military airplanes to somewhere else. And then one likely place is New Ishidaki Airport, which is a commercial airport located about 30 minutes from Taiwan. And then that is militarily, it makes sense to move military airplanes to New Ishidaki Airport. Current Japanese law stipulates that Japan cannot use any commercial or any non-military facility to be used for military purpose unless Japan is attacked. So in this scenario, Japan is not attacked, but Japan will be in the position that to be asked to let the U.S. military use a commercial airport. That is one of the major challenges. And then also all the experts say it's from the military perspective, it's a good idea. It's a kind of optimal strategy is diversifying the military airplanes to as many airports as possible so that no single airport will become the good target of the attack. So in that sense, the point here is when Japan has to cooperate with the United States, Japan has to do something extra legal. And then question is whether Japan is ready. Well, my impression of the discussion with the experts, both in Washington, D.C. and Tokyo, is experts in Washington, D.C. are more optimistic than experts in Tokyo. So, but I myself, I'm not the expert directly involved in this debate, but I'm just listening to their views. So, well, today we have 4 experts on the security here, and then including the various security issues, including a new security issue area that is cybersecurity. And as I said yesterday, we have all-star speakers today. And the first speaker is Professor Diana Newton, my colleague, and then in many occasions, she is my partner in crime. We taught together Tower Scholars Program class a few years ago, and then also we are directing SME in Japan program at Kansei Gakuin University. And some of you have been there. For last 2 years, and I'm really enjoying working with her. And she's going to talk about U.S.-Japan relations from Washington's perspective. Of course, prospect for the likelihood of Trump's election in November is a very hot issue. And then Akita-san asked that question yesterday, what should Japan do if that is the case? It's a hot issue. So we are all looking forward to her discussion. Second speaker is Dr. Adam Less, teaching at the Indiana University and Georgetown University. And he's actually speaker of both Japanese and Chinese. So he will bring the China factor in the discussion. And then, of course, Taiwan is one of the biggest issues. And then it's also related to all the 3 issue areas that Dr. Solis mentioned yesterday: deterrence, economic security, and China. Right? So, so he will talk about well, U.S., Japan, China relations. So he will talk about this issue, including the China factor. And the third speaker is Mihoto Matsubara, who is a cyber specialist. Actually, we had never met until this time, but I have known her work a lot, and then she has written a lot of works, and her 2 books who received very prestigious prizes in Japan. Unfortunately, both are in Japanese, so unless you're able to read Japanese, you cannot read it. For those students, that's actually one of the advantages that if you have a language. So Matsubara-san talks about, she is an expert, I would say the expert of the cybersecurity. She will talk about well, cybersecurity aspect of this issue. And discussant is Stan Crow, my friend, and also our friend, Tower Center's friend, fellow of the Tower Center. And you can see his bio. And I really appreciate your contribution to the Tower Center. And then also I'm really enjoying working with you. We did a program together in Tokyo last year. So he will discuss and moderate the discussion. So please join me for welcoming the excellent panel.
I think, can you all hear me? Thank you very much for such a lovely introduction. I appreciate my partner in crime giving me such a rave review. And I'm just really grateful to be on this panel with such impressive colleagues who know so much about their areas, and Stan Crow is our discussant. So last night, many of you heard Dr. Mireya Solis discuss her interesting and informative new book titled Japan's Quiet Leadership, Reshaping the Indo-Pacific. I happen to agree with Dr. Solis, and I find her scholarship spot on. and I don't want to be flip in kicking off this conference, but it did occur to me that perhaps my talk should have a parallel title, something like America's Chaotic Leadership, also reshaping the Indo-Pacific. The American reshaping is not necessarily what I would like to see, as the U.S. has become less reliable, less of a leader in the region, and inclined to turn its back on some of the international norms the U.S. not only helped establish, but also enforce for decades. In pulling back globally and becoming dysfunctional domestically, the United States has created power vacuums that have been filled by authoritarian leaders, but also by allies, especially Japan, which I'll talk about a little bit later. As of today, we have seen two one-term presidential administrations since 2016. In the Asia-Pacific region, the Trump administration faced several issues that range the gamut from trade disputes to military threats, from climate concerns to territorial issues. What made American responses to each situation challenging to friends, partners, and competitors alike was the lack of consistency or coherence in our responses between 2016 and 2020. While we have often had presidents who repudiated all that their predecessors stood for, Congress and the laws that it passed used to provide some consistency between Democratic and Republican administrations. Unfortunately, it has now become nearly impossible to pass legislation in Congress, resulting in each president signing executive orders to implement their policy initiatives. These executive orders are quickly and easily overturned by their successors, making it easy to see why our allies and partners feel that they're suffering whiplash from one administration to the next. President Trump's lack of discipline around messaging, as well as his constant tweeting from the hip, took these policy shifts to a new level. His style left allies as well as competitors wondering what would happen next. Some would say this worked to America's advantage by keeping everyone on their back foot, forcing our allies to do more around the globe. Some would say it deeply weakened U.S. credibility, power, and leadership. I'm going to talk about a few policy initiatives and outcomes undertaken by both the Trump and Biden administrations in the region, and conclude with what Japan has been doing and should be doing throughout America's ups and downs. On North Korea, President Trump and leader Kim Jong-un went from calling each other names like Little Rocket Man and Dotard to writing love letters, as President Trump tweeted. President Trump is the first president of the United States ever to meet with the North Korean head of state. He did so twice and stepped foot into North Korea as well. Within a year of those negotiations, that relationship faltered and failed with no tangible progress or deliverables for the bilateral relationship or the region. The only lasting initiative from the Trump-Kim summits was a suspension of U.S.-South Korea military trainings, which took South Korea and other allies in the region like Japan by surprise. On China, President Trump admired the ultimate authority that Xi wielded and began his administration complimenting Xi, making statements like he is a brilliant leader and a great man. But when Trump's bragging about how great a man Xi was and how special their relationship was did not resolve the U.S.-China trade deficit, Trump levied tariffs on China, increasing them over time from 10% to 25%. China reciprocated with tariffs of its own, and not much progress was made in terms of improved relations, especially when the U.S. started targeting Chinese telecom firms. It became clear that the threats from China were more than just trade-related, and the competition between the two nations encompassed trade, investment, and technology. Meanwhile, President Xi did not back off one bit regarding China's intentions towards Taiwan during the Trump administration, which has continued into the Biden administration. In fact, I would argue that Russia's initial poorly executed invasion of Ukraine did more to shift Beijing's thinking on timing related to its hope to annex Taiwan than any diplomatic or military pressure from the United States. On trade, President Trump pulled the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership within 3 days of taking office, even though the hard-fought pact required all members to adhere to stringent transparency and trade liberalization standards. The parties leading the negotiations, including Japan and the U.S., intended to set a new bar that would prevent countries who would not or could not adapt such high standards from being included, presumably China. Given the time, effort, and political capital spent hammering out these new trade standards, it is not difficult to see why many of our allies and partners felt frustrated with the abrupt withdrawal undertaken by the Trump administration. To our allies and negotiating partners, it felt reminiscent of President Obama's decision not to act when Syria used chemical weapons and crossed his self-defined red line. To be fair, the U.S. Congress would not probably have ratified the trade pact even if the president had not pulled out of it. So I think all of these things under the Trump administration caused people to wonder, when can the US be counted on? And despite the change in language and rhetoric after the 2020 election, US consistency and reliability has not skyrocketed in the Indo-Pacific region over the past 3+ years. President Biden, too, has been hobbled by the US public and the dysfunction of Congress. He is also not viewed as a strong leader at home or abroad, facing accusations about his mental fitness to serve and his tendency to bumble his remarks. He does not necessarily inspire respect in the eyes of other nations. At home, he is having trouble even getting credit for a strong economy, which we all know presidents do not technically deserve, but usually get when the Dow is this high and unemployment is this low. In the Indo-Pacific region, President Biden has had some successes and some failures like his predecessor. There was no chance that the Biden administration would be able to rejoin the TPP, given that both political parties in the United States have repudiated the benefits of large multilateral trade agreements, equating globalization and trade with losses of jobs and increased wealth disparity. The inconsequential Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, that the Biden administration has proposed in lieu of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is now was likened by one official as a fried egg with no yolk because it has no substance or nutrition. American businesses and the media have referred to it as meaningless or hollow because it lacks the stringent trade standards that the TPP offered. Regarding the bilateral relationships with China and North Korea, the Biden administration also struggled. North Korea has rebuffed all calls by the State Department to restart talks, stating that the US must first abandon its quote-unquote hostile and antagonizing policies towards the DPRK. Instead of negotiations, there has been a steep increase in Kim Jong-un's missile tests, as well as the number of containers of munitions and missiles that North Korea is sending to Russia in exchange for aid and fuel. The Biden administration did resume Republic of Korea, US joint military exercises in the summer of 2022 after President Yoon took office in South Korea, which I think was welcomed by many allies in the region. Regarding China, the first meeting between the Biden administration officials and the Chinese officials in 2021 started with a 15-minute diatribe by China's chief diplomat Yang, aimed at the president's national security advisor and secretary of state. This rocky start was followed by a face-to-face meeting between President Biden and Chinese President Xi in November of 2022, when the two tried to talk about ways to coexist despite their disagreements on the margins of a G20 meeting in Indonesia. In June of 2023, President Biden referred to President Xi as a dictator in explaining how the US shot down a Chinese spycraft balloon discovered over the continental US, which did not do much to enhance bilateral relations. The two leaders met again at a carefully crafted summit in San Francisco in November of 2023, which received headlines like, quote, the Biden-Xi summit where low expectations were met, end quote, and summaries such as the summit may have closed a trap door under the world's most critical diplomatic relationship, which has plunged to its most acrimonious level in 50 years. Despite these low expectations in the solo press conference that followed, President Biden reiterated that he does view Chinese President Xi as a dictator. Needless to say, for Biden to double down on this accusation in the wake of the summit, relations were not improved as the summit had hoped to do, even if the shoe fits. I would be remiss if I did not mention a big win for President Biden in the region with regard to South Korea. To be fair, much of the credit goes to President Yoon of South Korea, who has made improving relations with Japan and the United States a top priority since being elected in May of 2022. President Biden and his team have leaned into that effort, even hosting the South Korean leader for a state dinner in April of last year. This is an aside, but President and Mrs. Biden are about to host their 5th state dinner. 4 of the 5 have been with countries in the Indo-Pacific region: Australia, India, South Korea, and soon to be Japan. The 5th country was France. It was the first state dinner, and it actually, I think, was an olive branch coming out of the Indo-Pacific region when the Americans were able to persuade the Australians to buy US nuclear submarines instead of French submarines, which caused a rift. And in trying to repair that, the Bidens invited Macron to the White House. So in the end, everything comes back to the Indo-Pacific. The Biden administration has worked skillfully with new leadership teams in South Korea and Japan since Yoon and Kishida took office, working through the staff at the NSC and the state and defense departments to improve trilateral relations. President Biden hosted President Yoon of South Korea and Prime Minister Kishida of Japan last summer at Camp David. This historic summit resulted in a statement of principles and a joint statement that planned for a regular schedule of trilateral meetings between the leaders, not unlike the G7 and NATO leader meetings, Trilateral meetings will also take place annually between foreign ministers, defense ministers, national security advisors, and other cabinet level officials. The meetings are supposed to cover a wide range of issues, including annual military exercises, contingency planning, missile defense, economic security, supply chains, emerging technologies, development assistance, and countering disinformation. Small agenda. The Biden administration has made a huge effort to institutionalize this relationship so that it will withstand a transition of presidential power in the United States. And the recent institutionalization is important is because many people expect that President Trump may go from being the 45th president to the 47th president, following in Grover Cleveland's shoes as the second president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. At this point in U.S. history, Grover Cleveland is the only person to run for a non-consecutive term and win. Other notable men tried, including Van Buren, Fillmore, and Grant, as well as Teddy Roosevelt, who tried to have a third non-consecutive term before we had term limits. Now Donald J. Trump joins this group, and the unpredictability of his first term in office worries many of our allies and partners. And I would argue, not to fear, Japan is here. Japan was there for the United States during Trump 1, and Japan will be here for the United States through our next presidential administration and the mix of strange and tumultuous times in the United States and worldwide. To quote my colleague, a leaderless world order, right? I believe that a Trump 2.0 administration would not particularly change the direction of Japan's foreign policy, which has made the island nation indispensable to the stability of the region as well as around the world. During Trump's presidency, Japan, through the distinct personality and leadership of Abe Shinzo, met the president where he was and crafted a relationship, even a friendship, that ensured that Japan remained an important ally to the US. This is not to say that President Trump did everything that Prime Minister Abe asked, but it did mean that President Trump took the Prime Minister's phone calls, listened to his thoughts, and maintained a bilateral relationship, even if there were moments of tension over trade and military burden sharing. In addition to staying off President Trump's bad list and avoiding high-profile blowups like other leaders around the world, Prime Minister Abe modified the TPP, renaming it the Comprehensive Partnership Agreement for Trans-Pacific Trade, or the CPTPP, and pushed it through. The Prime Minister also initiated and strengthened 2 security strategies for the region, which the Trump administration ended up adopting. The concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific, which the US has now embedded in the name change to our Pacific Command, which is now Indo-PACOM, and the reinvigoration of the Quad, the security alliance including the US, Japan, India, and Australia. This begs the question of how Prime Minister Kishida will fare in building a friendship with President Trump, since Prime Minister Abe is sadly no longer with us after being assassinated on the campaign trail in the summer of 2022. Many would say that Prime Minister Kishida is no Abe, but he also doesn't have Abe's World War II legacy, family, or hawkish background, which helps Japan in the region. Trying to win the trust of a potential President Trump is actually the least of the Prime Minister's worries today, as Japan drops from the 3rd largest economy to the 4th, below Germany, and the Prime Minister faces a political scandal at home related to LDP politicians and their misuse of political donations. I don't know what will happen in the upcoming diet elections in April, the internal LDP party polls on Kishida's leadership in September, and the general election in October of this year, but I am cautiously optimistic that whatever happens politically in Japan, the nation will remain our #1 ally and a heavy lifter on the policy issues, regardless of who wins the US presidency. In fact, Aso Taro, former Prime Minister and former Finance Minister and current Vice President of the LDP, has been deputized to make contact with the Trump team. He traveled to New York and Washington in January in hopes of securing a behind-the-scenes meeting with President Trump. The meeting did not happen, but Japan is playing the long game, working to show a man who personalizes policy like no one else that Japan wants to have a relationship with. In short, I don't think that the United States needs to panic because Japan is already on point in its security strategy in the region. The LDP is raising defense spending to 2% of GDP, putting Japan on course to have the world's 3rd largest defense budget by 2027. The self-defense forces continue to acquire up-to-date military equipment and bolster defense of the Ryukyu island chain that includes Okinawa and peters out less than 70 miles from Taiwan. Japan has improved defense and diplomatic relations with South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, India, and others, while coordinating the creation of high-tech supply chains beyond China's reach. Japan has committed to support Ukraine since Russia's invasion and has taken the lead among developed democracies on outreach to the global south. These policy initiatives are transforming Japan and its role in the world. This is not to say that a second Trump administration would not present the bilateral relationship with concerns. There's a general expectation that a second Trump cabinet would have more loyalists who would remove the long-term public servants in their agencies in favor of political staffers rather than experts in the area, which could make bilateral relations more challenging. In addition, President Trump has never liked multilateral alliances, and his sentiments could slow or halt any Indo-Pacific coalition building that President Biden and Prime Minister Kishida have been chasing. The region is fraught with tensions, especially surrounding territorial disputes where China is the aggressor, and a Trump presidency is unlikely to provide cautious, strategic statements that are meant to preserve the status quo. All bets are off if a re-elected President Trump sees Taiwan as a bargaining chip to be played rather than as an ally to be protected, as he seems to see NATO partners who are not spending 2% of their GDP on defense. If President Biden wins in November, then we will see more of the same. Coalition building, prioritizing multilateral alliances, flexing military muscle and joint exercises, but also little ability to bring Congress on board when it comes to trade, aid, or even military engagement. The United States remains a partner engaged in and committed to global affairs, then Japan will continue its trajectory as one of our most highly valued allies, if not the most. If our own domestic turmoil prevents the U.S. from continuing to preserve, I'm sorry, that's my phone, I think it's in my pocket. That's mine. Yes, it's the backpack, Scotland's mine. That's the alarm, not the alarm. Yeah. I am so sorry. To my students who are in the room, I am truly appalled. I'll just restate my conclusion, which is my last paragraph. If the United States remains a partner engaged in and committed to global affairs, then Japan will continue its trajectory as one of our most highly valued allies, if not the most. If our own domestic turmoil prevents the U.S. from continuing to preserve the global order, then I believe Japan will step up and step in as needed, regardless of the upcoming election outcome in Japan or in the United States. As the post-World War II bilateral relationship turns 80 next year, I believe that Japan is coming into its own power, and that regardless of who wins the White House in November, the United States is lucky to have a friend and partner in Japan. Thank you.
Take this one for you. Okay. All right. Thanks, Diana. What's
also talk. Okay, cybersecurity is working. So I'd like to also talk about, because Adam already talked about Taiwan scenarios. So I also talk a little bit about Taiwan scenarios from cybersecurity perspectives. Does it sound good to you?
Yeah.
Okay. So. So I'd like to talk about now why cybersecurity is getting more important for Japan, but also for Japan-U.S. alliance, and what Japan has been doing in terms of cybersecurity, and what can we do through this Japan-U.S. alliance. So I think that there are three major lessons we can learn from the ongoing war in Ukraine in terms of cybersecurity. And I recently published another co-authored op-ed from Nikkei Asia with my Taiwanese friend, Yuster Yu. So three lessons, namely, cyber is the important part of the 21st century war. So cybersecurity or cyber attacks are embedded in the 21st century types of war. So we will see it in the next future conflict, either in the Taiwan Strait or other regions as well. And cyber is already in a component in the conflict in the Middle East too, even though we do not see much in the media. And the second is that the good defenses would work well, even against the really strong adversary in the cyber domain. So everybody saw that Ukraine would be defeated by massive cyber attacks from Russia. But it didn't happen so far. Why? Because Ukraine took 8 years to build up their cyber defenses. And the Russians have been doing cyber attacks since the 1980s. So they have 3 decades of cyber attacks history, but still good cyber defenses would work. And finally, the third is that the public-private partnerships are so crucial in cybersecurity. Why? Because the cyber domain is fundamentally unique and different from other domains. Cyber domain is the only domain consisting of artificial items, technologies, software, hardware, but ground or space, everything not non-artificial, natural items. So that is why you have to have companies' collaborations to double down your cyber defenses. So the Ukrainians have done a lot to prepare for potential cyber attacks from adversaries, including Russia. And because the United States had already anticipated that Russia would invade Ukraine as of fall 2021. So according to the Financial Times, the US Army and the US industry sent the team of cybersecurity experts to Ukraine between October and November 2021. And they specifically look into the networks of Ukrainian critical infrastructures. Why? Because looking at the history of Russian cyber attacks, they expected Russians already embedded their wiper malware in the networks of Ukrainian critical infrastructure companies. And surely they did in the networks of the Ukrainian railway. And can you please remind yourself what you see in the eves of the February 24th of 2022? How Ukrainian citizens evacuated from their own country, and how Ukrainian military received their military aid from other countries. Railway. Imagine if the American team was not able to find and delete malware from the networks of Ukrainian railway beforehand. So they might have been able to paralyze the operations of the railway. In that case, the Ukrainians will never be able to evacuate their citizens outside their countries or receive the humanitarian aid or military aid from different countries through Poland. And also the Ukrainians did their own cyber defense efforts too. So in January 2022, 1 month before the invasion started, the Ukrainians started to see a significant increase in the disruptive cyber attacks to their government, but also to their financial institutions. So the Ukrainian government thought, so we had thought that we did every effort to increase our cyber defenses, but there might have been some vulnerabilities in our cyber defenses. So we should look into that. So that's why they used our red teams to actually launch offensive cyber attacks on their own IT systems. And if they find any vulnerable systems, they patched and they build up their cyber defenses. So they did every effort, utmost efforts to increase their cyber defenses until the last minute. And if you're interested in Japanese cybersecurity or the big news in Japan, you might already remember that a big ransomware attack hit the port of Nagoya, which is the largest and busiest commercial port in Japan. And this cyber attack actually paralyzed the operations of cargo shipping for 2 days in July 2023. And everybody thought that, oh, this might have been just a regular ransomware attack from a criminal group. But the Financial Times later reported that this might have been an attempt by a state actor, such as China, to test Japan's defenses. And I haven't seen any follow-up news reports or any press release from the government or cybersecurity vendors, but I thought that this is a really interesting analysis of this ransomware attack. And China has already done multiple ransomware attacks for financial reasons, but not necessarily for disruptive only reasons. And starting from February 2023, the US government started to vocally raise their concerns over potential usage of disruptive cyber attacks in the case of Taiwan crisis. Again, cyber attacks would be the crucial component of the 21st century style of war or conflict. The reason why the US government anticipated that cyber will be the component of the future conflict is that to deter US military actions by impeding US decision-making processes, inducing social panic, and also interfering with the deployment of US forces to the conflict zone. And specifically, the annual threat assessment in February 2023 gave multiple examples of potential targets by the Chinese cyber attacks, namely oil and gas pipelines and rail systems. And 5 months later, the New York Times actually reported that the Biden administrations already anticipated that the Chinese have already penetrated into the networks of US critical infrastructure companies, namely electricity, communications, and water supplies to support US bases in and outside the United States. So the back in February 2023, the US intelligence report was more specifically focused on critical infrastructure companies within the United States. But now, or even though that this is not from the government, New York Times article, but this is now expanded the scope of potential targets outside the United States. And who will be the most important allied countries to the United States in the case of Taiwan Strait crisis? And which country has more US bases to support US actions to do that? Japan. And 6 months later, now the Washington Post published another shocking article. Actually, the Chinese have been able to breach a water facility in Hawaii, major port on the West Coast, and the oil and gas pipeline in the United States over the last year. And these critical infrastructure sectors already mentioned in the New York Times article and also the US intelligence report. And this January, this year, the US government announced in a collaboration with other Five Eyes countries that they had disrupted Chinese hacking operations against the communications, energy, transportation, and water. And the US government also mentioned that these cyber attacks are not only directed against the United States, but also other foreign victims. And the US government didn't name which countries were exactly targeted. But it's also interesting that which countries will be the most important allies for the United States, and also in case of the Taiwan contingency. So that is why now the United States and Japan have more reasons why we should focus on cybersecurity in the broader context of security collaborations, and also to prepare for any contingency in the region. Okay, so let's look at what Japan has done in terms of cybersecurity. So the self-defense forces, because now I'd like to talk more about the security collaboration between Japan and the United States. So let me focus on self-defense forces and cybersecurity efforts. So so even though that it's not having much reported in the English media outlet, so the self-defense forces have been doing a lot in terms of cybersecurity. So for example, the Japan ground self-defense forces started to send a liaison officer to the U.S. Army Cyber Center of Excellence in Georgia since October 2016. And the Japan ground self-defense forces already started cybersecurity programs to teach not only the Army, but also Air Force and Navy. Why? Because the JGSDF is much larger compared to the Japanese Navy and Air Force. So that's why they're doing that. And the JGSDF also has a high school, and they already started to provide cybersecurity education programs as well. And I know that the Japanese self-defense forces have been criticized a lot because they have a much smaller cyber defense command component compared to Americans or other countries. But they are already actually doubled the number of the cyber defense command this year compared to last year. And they already have different cyber command components in the west and the east, and also the middle part of Japan. And not only that, now self-defense forces have been doing a lot to incorporate cyber components in the multi-domain, cross-domain exercises, not only with Japan, not only with American counterparts, but also inviting Australians as well. Australians and the British as well. And even though that Japan is not a member state of the NATO, but Japan is a member of the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn, Estonia, after Prime Minister Abe visited Estonia several years ago. So NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence has been doing an annual cyber exercise, mainly with the NATO states members, but also started to invite other countries as well, including Japan. And Japan, for the first time, participated in this exercise in 2021. And because this locked shield exercise has become so popular, so you have to team up with another country. So two countries will be always pair. And in the first year, back in 2021, Japan teamed up with the United States. But interestingly enough, United States sends Indo-PACOM from Hawaii. And also, it is really interesting that Japan not only sent military defense and self-defense forces, but also civilian agencies and critical infrastructure companies. Why? Because if any conflict or war happens, cyber attacks will target not only military or civilian agencies, but critical infrastructure companies, what we have seen in Ukraine. And the next year, Japan teamed up with British. And the last year, Australia. Again, Americans, British, and Australians have only sent their military or the military defense, but always Japan sends the civilian agencies and critical infrastructure companies. And well, it's a public information, but the NTT also sends our teams to this exercise too. I think this is really important for Japan because if anything happens, either in the peacetime or the wartime, everybody has to come together because everybody has a cybersecurity components and there's no boundary. So the military, defense, civilian agencies and critical infrastructure companies have to get together and share expertise and also cyber threat intelligence to make sure that the damages will be minimum. So I think this is really important for Japan to send everybody to this kind of exercise. And it's really difficult to gauge what kind of cybersecurity capabilities each country has, because nobody really wants to reveal their true capabilities, especially in terms of the offensive capabilities. But this CyberNet exercise hosted by the Dutch Cyber Command is a bit different because this is not only about cyber defense capabilities, but also about offensive capabilities. And last year, 2023, Japan sent self-defense forces and it ranked the third. So this is really interesting. And Adam already talked about the Japanese national security strategy from 2022. So the 2002 version of the new strategy talks a lot about cybersecurity capabilities. And they talked about active cyber defense to try to minimize the damages caused by disruptive cyber attacks even before that cyber attack happens, and also talks about threat hunting capabilities. So threat hunting is something that the United States has done before the invasion started against Ukrainians to try to look into your networks to make sure that footage, any trace of cyber attacks are not there. And if you see something or anything wrong, then you will delete it. So Japan is trying to increase the capability of threat hunting as well. And the self-defense forces will increase the size of cyber defense command from now it's over 2,000, but it's going to be also almost 4,000 by Japanese fiscal year 2027. And the Japanese government already has done this year's to submit the new registrations to the draft of security clearance under the Economic Security Promotion Act this March. And this is expected to expand the collaborations to share more sensitive information between the government and industry. And also the NISC, the Japanese Cybersecurity Center, already doubled the size of the staffers this April. So Japan is doing a lot. So what kind of next steps now we want to see between Japan and the United States in terms of cybersecurity? Well, we have to make sure that now we have a long-term cyber defense build-up, not only in Japan, but also between Japan and the United States. Why? Looking at Ukraine, long-term cyber defense is crucial to fight against the huge adversary. And also not only the Japanese and American government and military expand their cyber defenses capabilities, but we also have to have a collaboration from the industry as well. And Japan and the United States have been doing a lot in terms of cyber security exercises, but not necessarily we've seen that Americans send their critical infrastructure companies to join that type of exercises. So this might be another area we can look into. And we've already doing the Quad collaborations to expand our cybersecurity collaborations. But what we haven't seen yet is Japan, U.S, Taiwan collaboration on cybersecurity. I know that this can be the sensitive issue, especially given the diplomatic ties between Japan and Taiwan. So that is why I think the industry would play a major role to play, because they do not have to worry too much about diplomatic status, and we can overcome political struggles. So thank you very much, and I look forward to having your questions.
That's fantastic. So thank you so much to each of the panelists, and Adam and François. Fantastic. I took a lot of notes here because everything you said was just so fascinating and so appropriate and relevant for right now for us to consider. So what I'm going to do for this next portion is I'll kick off the discussion with a short framing of a couple of thoughts that I have, and then I'll sort of take the prerogative as a discussant and ask each of the panelists one question before opening it up to the audience for discussion. And also, if the panelists have questions for each other, then you can get into the mix as well. So hopefully it'll be very active. So please begin thinking about your questions just a few moments from now. But in my reflection on this, what was occurring to me, and you know, Adam, I appreciated your closing comment that you wanted to get into details in the discussion. I'm going to try to drive us in that direction. But just a little bit of framing first. So Hiroki, this morning, as you were leading off, you talked about security.
Okay, good afternoon. Please keep enjoying lunch. But we are going to start the interesting discussion. Okay. Well, I'm so delighted to introduce today's luncheon keynote speaker, Mr. Hiroyuki Akita of the Nikkei. I would say to me, he is the best journalist I know. Sorry, Otoshi-san. But I have read his article since I was a college student. And at that time, of course, I didn't imagine that I would meet him in person in the future. He has been, so you can see the bio, but he has served as a bureau chief of both Washington, D.C. and Beijing. These are the two most important bureaus for any Japanese newspaper. And then also, most recently, he wrote a lot of articles about developing countries, the global south. And I heard that he went to foreign trip 20 times for last year, and including many developing countries. He went to India 3 times. He went to Georgia, former Soviet Republic, Georgia, not Atlanta, Georgia. He went to Georgia 3 times. And then also he went to many other interesting countries, including Ukraine. Last November, he interviewed President Zelensky in Kyiv for 1 hour without interpreter. And then, he wrote a few articles that in Nikkei, they are very interesting. So today he talks about kind of very topic of our symposium, that is the rise of authoritarianism and what we, U.S. and Japan, could do and should do. Please join me for welcoming Mr. Akita.
Well, thank you very much for having me today. It is very honored to speak at this conference. My face looks a little bit different from the picture on the program, but it is not the deep fake. It is a real, genuine Akita. Please don't worry. So, actually, I was a Washington correspondent for 4 years during Bush administration. So I had a lot of chance to come to Texas. And I remember every time when I came here, I enjoyed very delicious Texas beef, maybe more than necessary. So I feel that the part of belly fat here is made, part of it is made in Texas. So I'd like to think about it at the beginning. And in this maybe 20 minutes comment, I'd like to share with you my observation as a journalist, specifically on this topic. As Takeuchi-sensei mentioned, since last October, I traveled areas and countries at war or at the serious risk of the war, including Georgia, Tbilisi, and Ukraine. And also recently, I went to South China Sea and so on. So I feel very safe in Dallas, thanks God. But to put it simply, my biggest takeaway from those trips is that the world is becoming more and more dangerous than we observe from Tokyo or Dallas. World is more divided, and also world is shifting multipolar order, which is unstable. But by the way, due to my long absence from home, the order at my family is shifting rapidly to a unipolar order under the strong leadership of my wife. So that is a good news, but the world is becoming more unstable. So especially today's topic is the rise of authoritarianism. It is indeed a nightmare scenario, nightmare trend, but my impression is that this is not the worst scenario. Worst possible scenario for me is simultaneous war in Europe, Middle East, and Asia. And as we see later, it is not necessarily not necessarily groundless assumption, I think. So based on this context, I'd like to present my view about the challenge of U.S.-Japan relation or alliance. In short, the biggest challenge for us is to avoid nightmare scenario, so namely the Third World War. by collaborating each other. Specifically, I'd like to point out two major challenges. One is about how to deal with the rise of so-called connectivity of wars, linking Europe, Asia, and Middle East. And second challenge is about how to engage very angry global South, developing countries and so-called global South, developing country and emerging powers like India, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia, South Africa, those countries. So let's start by the first challenge, the rise of connectivity of war, or maybe I would say, maybe quasi-axis of wars linking Europe, Asia, and Middle East. In past, when we look back history, First World War, Second World War, and Cold War started in Europe, but spilled over to Asia very quickly. It took just 2 years after Nazi German invasion to Poland in 1939. Just 2 years later, small island country in Asia launched a surprising attack to Pearl Harbor. So at the era of transitional period, unthinkable event could happen within 2 years or 3 years time framework. And based on that, when we look back and observe Russian aggression to Ukraine and its impact on the world, we can witness the rise of the connectivity of wars again. So let's look at the connectivities between Russian aggression and Asian security situation. One example is North Korea, as I think Adam mentioned. North Korea had already provided at least several millions of artillery shells. It's massive to Russia. In addition, they also supplied short-range ballistic missiles. China. So far, China has not provided any. It is believed that China has not provided any lethal weapons, but China is supporting Russia economically, politically, diplomatically. And problem is that is not just one-way cooperation, but there is a payback. There must be payback from Russia. As for North Korea, it is believed that Russia is providing massive military assistance to accelerate North Korean nuclear missile capability. And also, some analysts believe that Russia had started to support North Korea to establish platforms such as nuclear submarine or SLBM. So it is very destabilizing. And as for China, we don't think that China needs any physical payback like that from Moscow. But actually, China is getting a lot of more important payback, or effectively, or China is benefiting a lot from a Russian continued aggression. One, Russian aggression is giving China much wider opportunity to act militarily in Taiwan Strait or South China Sea if necessary. China doesn't, China acts depends on its own calendar. So it doesn't mean that the Russian invasion will prompt China's invasion to Taiwan. It is not the case, but at least we can say that the windows of opportunity is widening. But moreover, Russia is teaching very good lesson to China, which means very bad lesson from our perspective. That is, nuclear blackmail works very well. NATO country is very, very unwilling to directly intervene to Ukraine to help Ukraine, just giving arms and weapons. One of the reasons is, Mr. Biden already mentioned, NATO wants to avoid nuclear exchange, nuclear war against Russia. So from China's perspective, Putin's war is proving that nuclear blackmail works very well. And if I were President Xi, I would assume that if I use very, very explicit nuclear blackmail against the US before I start invasion, full-scale invasion to Taiwan, or some military provocation, I assume that China can prevent US from intervening Taiwan Strait. If China have a huge stockpile of nuke. And so I don't think it's coincident that in past few years, China started to further accelerate the nuclear buildup. Now it has only 400 nuclear warhead, according to a Stockholm Peace Sipri think tank, in Stockholm. But according to Pentagon's estimate, China is likely to have about 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035. That is exactly the same number that US deploy now. It's quite soon. So my point is that Russian invasion is not being confined in Europe, but it is effectively started to spill over to other part of the region in Asia and also Middle East. I don't go into detail about Middle East, but we all know that Iran is providing many, many drones to Russia. When I was in Kyiv, Russia launched a massive attack by Iranian drones. I needed to evacuate to a shelter. By the way, they call it kamikaze drone, which is a very annoying name for Japanese, but also I'm sure that annoying name for US. So that is indeed one of the most important challenge that US Japan have to collaborate each other to deal with. So I will later I'd like to mention about what is the specific policy measures in order to deal that. But I'll stop here now and then go to a second challenge. Global South. So it's a so-called Global South, as developing countries and emerging countries in Middle East, Africa, and Latin America and Asia. Every time when I visit Global South countries, especially in Middle East and Africa, I'm shocked because they remind me that they are so angry to the West. Why? There are several reasons, but the simple reason is that Western massive sanction against Russia is triggering food crisis and energy crisis and so on. So that is hitting very vulnerable region of the world. So that is a very simple reason, but there is more serious reason for me, from my perspective. That is they are angry about so-called Western double standard or hypocrisy. One example of the double standard, according to them, is this. There have been serious conflict in Syria and Yemen, and many people are dying. But according to them, West have never made utmost effort to stop it. Of course, it send many humanitarian support and so on, but they didn't engage to stop it. Obama drew the red line about Syria, but didn't intervene. But as soon as war break out in Ukraine, according to them, West comes to Global South and preach them and demand them to support Ukraine. If they try to maintain neutrality, they preach them. How can you ignore what is happening in Ukraine? So from their perspective, it's kind of double standard. But on the top of that, I feel that the deep-rooted kind of grievances against the legacy of colonial history legacy. And they are not so vocal about it, but as they rise, as their influence and state power rises gradually, they are willing to be more vocal. So it is very important for U.S. Japan, together with other like-minded countries, to effectively engage those angry global south in the context of the risk of the Third World War, because I explained to you. So even though such a brutal invasion by Russia is going on in Ukraine, global south countries are not willing to take a side with West. According to a British economist intelligence unit analysis, 1/3 of the population in the world, only 1/3 support Western position. So this 1/3 include Western countries. So actually it is less than 1/3. And 1/3 remain neutral, and 1/3 even aligned with Russia. Of course, that includes China, which is big, so 1.3 billion. So in terms of population, it's big, but 1/3. So in order to any authoritarian power to avoid that, in order to avoid any authoritarian power to exploit the situation in quasi-war in Europe and to start a new war in other parts of the world, we really need to engage global south to at least bring some of them to our side. So that is the second important goal that US and Japan should pursue. And then that leads to my last comment. Then what is the specific policy options that we means US, Japan, could address these challenges? First, as for the risk of a Third World War or the emergence of the connectivity of war, I think one most effective approach is to enhance security cooperation by using multilateral framework. So that is what the media emphasized again and again last night at the dinner. I completely agree. Because unlike Europe, US only have bilateral security alliances that other panelists already mentioned. US, Japan, US, ROK, South Korea, US, Australia, and US, Philippines. But it is, as we observe from Tokyo, it is far from sufficient to deter China or even North Korea. Because due to the massive rapid military expansion by China, military balance of power in the Pacific, if you compare US forces in the Pacific and China's military capability, military balance had already shifted to the Chinese side very drastically. China now have more than 2 times more next generation of fighters and modern submarines and modern surface vessels than Indo-Pacific US forces. So it is important for US, Japan to reach out to other countries and by using a multilateral framework and enhance security cooperation to complement or supplement existing US alliance network in the Pacific. Actually, already there are such a framework to some extent. US, Japan, Korea, US, Japan, Australia, and also a Quad that includes India. But we really need, US, Japan really needs to go beyond to reach out non-US allies, but like-minded country that located in a very important geopolitical location, specifically South China Sea countries and South Pacific countries. I think it's very important in order to maintain stable geopolitical landscape in the Pacific. More specifically, maybe US, Japan, together with other allies to reach out Vietnam, Indonesia, and Singapore, Brunei, and also other South Pacific countries, and enhance security cooperation, including joint training, joint exercises, but more importantly, should enhance its assistance to increase, strengthening their coast guard capability so that they can patrol their maritime domain by themselves. So this is one option. And second, lastly, on the global south, most important and effective solution, as I observe, is to provide solution to those countries for them to be able to achieve sustainable economic development by overcoming food and energy or environmental problem. So on the contrary, worst approach is to just go there and preach about the value of democracy. For example, when I visit Middle East, some expert told me, China comes to their countries, drop lot of money, but no preach at all. Don't care. But the West doesn't come, or sometimes does come, but preach about democracy, human rights, which I do not disagree, but preach, but drop no money. So obviously, there are many, many autocratic countries in South, global South. Especially for those countries, it is obvious which is more favorable choice. So we really need to change this equation. In order to do that, U.S. Japan can collaborate with European countries more effectively to provide a solution, economic assistance, technology assistance, for them to overcome their own domestic problem better than China or other country. I think we can do it because Europe, Japan, and US have respectively different strengths. So Europe have many, many experiences in Middle East and Africa, and they have a lot of network in those areas as well. Likewise, Japan have a lot of experience of helping economic development in Asian countries and to some extent in Africa. And the US is, of course, an important security provider and many skills. So what we should do is for US and Japan and European officials get together and have a deeper look about how they can collaborate each other by making a full use of the division of labor and come up with a specific plan about how to engage in each region, because each region or each country have different needs, and then push forward that kind of cooperation. So it may take 5 years or 10 years, but it is not too late to start. Okay, I stop here. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you, Akita-san. It's very stimulating and provocative, I would say.
Maybe probably it's the task of role of journalists rather than moderating discussion.
So I actually have well, many questions, but I said one big question of about so-called global South anger to West, and I agree with you. So the solution should be for providing them with the idea of sustainable economic development. And so I'm actually working on global body chains now. And then the first books that was written about global body chains was Richard Baldwin, economist. And then his book's title is The Great Convergence. And then he actually talks about how developing countries benefit from global body chains. And then actually, the spread of global value chains actually benefit developing countries more than developed countries. That makes it much easier for developing countries to catch up. And then that's what has happened. And I think that what you described as a rise of anger of the developing countries, that those like anger had existed long time, right? But why now? The question answer is part of the answer is now they have developed, right? So so that's why that actually come out. So so in that sense, I think like there is a hope here, and then but at the same time, in terms of the question, why do they not appreciate? Like developed countries that really like invest and then foreign direct investment like started their development, and then like not all the countries, but quite a few countries like achieved sustainable economic development thanks to FDI, foreign direct investment. And then that's actually first question. Second question is this is a little bit simple. In my understanding, most of the global South countries want to have a good relationship with both United States and China. Right? So usually US and China are the two of the 3 or 5 highest trading partners. So so in that sense, it's actually they don't think that US or China, right? So I think that for US administration, I think it's better not to like push like choose US or China. So so that's actually the second point that I thought of. And the third thing that I thought of was, you mentioned colonialism, and I heard about like their experience of colonialism is one of the major sources of anger. It reminds me of like a history issue in East Asian countries that Japan has confronted. So do you think don't you think it's there is a room for Japan to cooperate with the United States that actually how Japan has treated the history issue with East Asian neighbors. And then that could be kind of somehow implications to the United States when US has to handle the anger of the global South.
Okay, so on the first question, why not? Their anger has existed for many years, decades. Simple answer is that, as you mentioned, they are achieving economic development quite rapidly. And when they have to suffer poverty, they rather contain their anger and then collaborate with European countries or post-colonial countries or other ways to get more aid and achieve economic development. But some of the countries are already significantly developed, and their living standard is getting better and better, and there is a growing middle income class. Under that circumstance, they tend to be more vocal politically also. So they do not hide their grievances. So in that sense, I think we cannot, I generalize global South, but we should separate global South to 3 categories. One is the global South such as India or Indonesia or Saudi Arabia, who are almost like coming to the top 10 of in terms of volume of G7, in terms of volume of GDP within 10 years. Maybe we should also increase Nigeria. And then the other side of the spectrum is country like sub-Saharan country like Central Africa or Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. Those countries suffer serious civil war, and some of the country, Russian Wagner are penetrating to those countries, and then there are many countries in between. So I think there are different needs and demand and priority among global South. So that is the one thought that came up is related to your first question. And second is West versus China. So first group Saudi or India, South Indonesia, they think they have their option. So they think that the world has shifted to a multipolar world already. And they, maybe India believe that they are the one polar. So in that sense, India wants to use that position to gain whatever they want from Russia and also West. And I think Indonesia and Saudi, and maybe I'm not so sure that Turkey is a global south, but Turkey is a very typical case. They are NATO countries, but they have a very good relation with Russia, and also they send a lot of drones to Ukraine to kill Russian soldiers. So that's a typical. So, but for second group, like Sub-Saharan, those countries, they don't have so much choices. So if they cannot get support from West, they even rely on Wagner, Russia. So I think again, we need to have a deeper look about the different category of the global South countries. And on the colonialism, yeah, if I step back and look back what Japan have been doing on this issue, is I think that reminds me that since Japan was the loser of the World War II, and then so Japan need to re-enter global community by reconciling with neighbors, China, South Korea, all Asian countries that Japan invaded or colonized. So diplomacy started from the reconciliation and also, how can I say, compensation, de facto compensation about what Japan did and so on. So Japan really needed to face history issue to come back to the world community. But the victors, the European countries, or maybe US, have a less problem like that. But instead, I'm sure that European countries are providing very generous economic support and also accommodating many students from post-colonial countries. So they made utmost effort to reconcile. But there's a difference. Japan made many apologies to many times to neighboring country, but I'm also sure that the head of European countries go to the post-colonial countries and made such efforts to apology many times. So I think that, to be honest, I'm not saying that the African countries, the Middle East are asking for that, but there is a deep-rooted kind of grievances. And on the top of that, China and Russia are conducting very, very effective information warfare for disinformation to amplify the anger. So, for example, Russia is conducting a so-called anti-colonialism campaign to consolidate Russia with those global South countries, and China also. China have a sentence of anti-colonialism at the constitution. So that is another factor. So I think that we really need to look at the current situation in order to offset their information penetration as well.
Thank you. I have more questions, but I'd like to open to floor. So let's start with Shi.
Thank you very much, and for a extremely interesting conversation here. And I want to follow up on the point that we need to, United States, Japan needs to win over the heart of the global South. And I actually share the observation with Hiroki that when it comes to, let's say, Southeast Asian countries and Middle East countries, we are not seeing them choosing between China and the United States. And so my question is how to prevent those countries from weaponizing the political capital of the competition that's going on between the United States and China when you are promoting, let's say, the campaign of winning over the heart of them. Thank you.
Sure. It is a legitimate question and tough question. But I have to say that Southeast Asian countries and other middle power countries, maybe including Japan, will be more forced to choose side rather than will have more leeway not to choose, not because of our choice, but because of the geopolitical trend. Unfortunately, as we observe, I think that the US and China's competition is entering to the level of new Cold War. It is not just over the maritime domain or cyber, but it's over the kind of state model or over the vision of the world order. So I assume we should assume that that will be, that will remain in coming years or decade, and even intensify. So I think it is increasingly become difficult for Southeast Asian countries or other Asian countries to not to choose. I'm not saying it is good, it is unfortunate, but it is a reality that we have to accept. Therefore,
Yeah, I also have a follow-up. When it comes to Southeast Asian countries, it actually over the past 3 years, if you look at the trade China have with the rest of the world, Southeast Asia ranks #1 as a trading partner of China throughout the pandemic. So that would be a big factor. And also when it comes to Middle East, think about at the beginning of this year, and BRIC actually included 5 Middle Eastern countries to it. And so China definitely have taken one step forward in forming alliances with global South. So how to, what's your take on that?
yeah. So I think that the geopolitical landscape in the context of US-China's new Cold War is totally different from that of US and the USSR Cold War. So as you mentioned, as you emphasized, there is so much interdependence between Asian countries and China, and which is reliance on China is much bigger than reliance on US. So it is not simple, and it is not simple, but after all, key question for each country would be, which is more important, political relation, security consideration, or economic? Of course, it is not a binary choice, but I believe that as the world becomes more and more dangerous, unfortunately, especially after Russian invasion, more rational country tend to incline to put a higher priority on survival in terms of security. So Japan already took a side with US. Of course, Japan is ally, and ROK and Australia. It's very simple. And Japan, of course, heavily rely on China economically. I think China is still the biggest trading partner in Japan, but Japan made a decision to follow US to impose de facto sanction on advanced semiconductor. China is very angry, and I think Japan is likely to follow US de facto sanction against China on quantum or AI technology. It's very, very painful. It will cause maybe big friction. But choice is to choose security alliance than economic opportunity. So obviously it's not black and white, but that is my view.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask, in Europe, throughout most of the late 20th century, there was a lot of disdain for Germany gaining increased economic and obviously military power due to their history in World War II. And I just wanted to ask, is there similar disdain for Japan gaining more economic power and military power? I know they're rearming. Is there similar disdain to what would otherwise be Japanese allies in the region?
Nice. What does disdain mean in this context?
I guess, disdain would be trying to.
Reluctance for Japan. In Japanese, okay. I think that that era is over. Unfortunately, that era is over because Japan cannot afford to disdain, indulge in a disdain, in reluctance, not to move forward. Because as Adam and other panelists described, Japanese economic security environment is deteriorating. I would say that Japan is in one of the most dangerous geopolitical locations in the world because Japan is surrounded by China, North Korea, Russia, and all of them have quite a lot nuclear stockpile and also conventional forces. So, and the US is allied, but it's very far. So on the top of that, Diana mentioned, there will be a very new president in the US after January. Hopefully, we know the result of the president's election by the late January. And so I think my point is that Japan doesn't have a luxury, but Japan has to survive. And in order to survive, Japan have realized that Japan have to invest more for self-defense instead of free riding or cheap riding on US. And in a way, Mr. Trump ran very good wake-up call that we cannot take US security umbrella for granted. So, yeah, that is my observation.
David.
Yeah, my question is, thanks for mentioning about the hardware build up of China in the Indo-Pacific region. With the recent shakeup of the PLA upper leadership for corruption and other, power struggle issues, how much of that can be discounted? My second question is, with Taiwan launching its own conventional power submarine last year, I haven't heard much from, I guess, the response from China or US or Japan. Is that so significant that nobody cares, or what's your view on that?
Yes, from your second question, I think China doesn't care so much about the Taiwan military buildup because let's compare Japan and China. The Japan military budget, defense budget is bigger than Taiwan. But Japan defense budget, China's defense budget is more than 4 times bigger than Japan. So I don't think that China care whether Taiwan, of course they are angry, but they care militarily whether Taiwan will have an indigenous submarine or not. Of course, it is painful, but they do not worry so much. But what they worry most is whether US will help intervene to help Taiwan. And in that context, whether Taiwan have its own submarine or not make difference, because if Taiwan submarine operate together with US military, maybe it means something. But if US does not, if Mr. Trump treat Taiwan as bargaining chip and abandon Taiwan, well, it doesn't, whether Taiwan will have its own submarine or not, doesn't matter so much. But on the first question, it's a more complex and important question, I think. Essentially, it is a question, key question about the empire, decline of empire. So key question is that, is empire more unpredictable and less benign when it is rising or it starts to decline? When we look back history, empire behave unpredictably or irrationally when it hit peak and then started to decline. It is a case, I believe, case of the Ottoman Empire. And extreme case is Japan Empire. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, not because Japan was confident because Japan was rising as a power, but Japan knew that Japan had only 2 years or less than 3 years oil reserve. So unless Japan acts now, Japan will just wait for the surrender. Because U.S. imposed U.S. oil embargo to Japan. So if this applies to China, if China, I'm very relieved. I'm not so worried as long as Xi Jinping, President Xi is saying that China is rising and the West is declining. Because this means that he can choose the time when he acts to annex Taiwan, for example. But if say, when he starts to say that, oh, China is hitting a peak and China is about to decline, which means China have less windows of opportunity. And China may act in a premature manner. So if Putin believed that he could wait another 10 years, I don't think that he invaded Ukraine at that time with the insufficient troops. But he took a gamble because he knew that Russian Empire is about to decline. So I'm not so sure that China's internal problem like economic stagnation or full of the corruption issue will work. Maybe to some extent, having said that, to some extent, it will work in a way to make China more cautious. I wouldn't deny there is that kind of element, but there's another element which could be negative potential for us. And I would say offset minus. That is my view. Diana.
Thank you. Thank you for such a great talk. I'm going to take you to your comment about how we need more multilateral coalitions and ask if you, because there are a lot of one-off coalitions or sort of small group military coalitions in the region, but are you kind of advocating for a more formal arrangement like a NATO? Do we go back to the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization? I know that didn't last long, but are you thinking that we need this to be more formalized than the Quad, U.S.-Japan relationship, AUKUS, etc.?
I think that if possible, it is preferable to formalize, but I think as you may know, it's impossible because possible official U.S. ally already exists. And I'm not so sure that you can add on that because as you know, there's question, so much pressure from China and also from the US side, but pressure not to take side with US. So diving into official security arrangement with US would require huge risk, right? So maybe if US decided to deploy its permanent troops in, let's say, Malaysia, maybe Malaysia may consider about it, but also there is Mr. Trump factor. So I don't think that we can hope for the formation of the official alliance network. So second best approach is unofficial, well, factual, unilateral. So there aren't any legal, framework, but they meet occasionally and conduct joint exercise, training, and so on. So that is kind of a realistic approach.
Right. Thank you. Are we seeing a situation where the developing countries and other countries are now picking and choosing who they want to go to, rather than I must go to China or I must go to the US. I'm thinking, for example, like Saudi Arabia, where China brokered the normalization of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Do you think we'll be seeing that in the Southeast Asia or in the global South?
Yeah, so I said, I answered the question on that regard and said that there is a less leeway, less room for Southeast Asian countries to not to choose.
Right.
But having said that, maybe we have to have a deeper look and kind of separate several groups, divide ASEAN country into several groups. I would say first group have a potential to play that game. That is Indonesia. Maybe I'm not so sure other ASEAN country. Indonesia is a big country and located in central in Pacific, not the part of the continent. So they are relatively safe, and they have about how many? They formulate 40% of the population of ASEAN, and they are affluent of natural resources. So I think that Indonesia is trying to play the same game of like Saudi and Turkey. But so second category is Indo-China ASEAN. Indo-China ASEAN that are located to neighbor of China, like Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar. I'm not so sure that they have so much choice to play that game because of the geographic proximity. And so in between, third category is like Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore. They are not so close to China as much as Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia. So they are in between, they are peninsula ASEAN. And I'm sure that they are, to some extent, they have a room to play, not to choose completely. And then try to gain from both, but not to the extent of Indonesia. So that is, so there is a difference among the ASEAN. So in short, this will, I would say this will weaken the unity of ASEAN. They always say that unity of ASEAN, but the unity of ASEAN will get weaker and weaker because of the difference of the geopolitical environment in the context of US-China strategic competition.
Last question from Johan.
What's your take on India, which you talked about briefly earlier? Because it seems to be trying to be the leader of the global South and playing very active roles now in the BRIC nations, which are expanding in its membership. And also the most recently at the Munich Security Conference, Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister, proudly announced that they are very smart to buy Russian crude oil, and the US, have to buy from us, so we can make profit. So with the possible change, if not probable change in the White House, how do you see India continues its path to become more independent and self-interest seeking?
Yeah, thank you very much. So, short answer is, after all, India is India. India is India, and they believe India is India, nothing else. But the but relatively longer answer is that two aspects that answer your question. One aspect, India, as I talk to the people, I mean policymakers and think tankers in India, I believe more firmly that their goal is multiple order. Indeed, they say multiple order, including the United States. For Japan, I don't want the US to downgrade in one polar. But in India, they say the experience over 200 years of colonization by UK, and also the existence of a very big rival like China, they never want any country to dominate potentially. So for them, multiple order is ideal order. And of course, they assume they are the strong power. So in that context, they never want Russia to collapse because China will dominate. So that's the reason, that is a deep reason for them to partly ally. Try not the reason why they still maintain good relations with Russia. People say it's always because of the Indian reliance on Russian economy, and also India is making a lot of profit by the exporting Russian oil. This is a tactical reason, but the strategic reason is that they want Russia to remain as a relatively great regional power to counter China and want them to be one of the power. And of course, India wants the US to stay as a very, very strong power, but not dominant power. So in this context, I think China, India is moving. But another aspect is that, so that is a kind of strategic level. But on the practical or tactical level, my biggest finding in India last trip in February, is that they prefer Trump rather than Biden. And to be precise, they don't care whether it's going to be Mr. President Biden or Trump. They don't worry about Mr. Trump. Or maybe some of them even prefer Trump because of the two reasons. One, India has so many things to offer. India is big market, and India is rising power. So Trump's actual president is much easier to deal with, rather than liberal president to pressure on human rights issue or so on. So Mr. Trump, they have confidence that they can deal with Mr. Trump. And secondly, if Mr. Trump becomes a president, US-Russia relation is maybe likely to get better. That will give more room for India to maintain good relations with Russia. So that is very conducive to their strategic goal, multiple goal. And thirdly, Mr. Trump may adopt a very, very tough, even tougher approach to China, or even disruptive approach to China, which is good for India. So kind of like a very, very selfish, but that is India. And we cannot blame India. Every country after all try to think their own national interests. And India is quite, in a way, very explicit in that one.
This is actually the topic that we can talk for ever. So we have to finish here and then moving to the afternoon panel, and we are talking about economy, economic security, and the international order. So how much data money can solve the problem that we have discussed. Yeah, well, it was very stimulating and provocative discussion. Thank you very much, Ashita-san. Please join me for thank you. The panel two, afternoon panel starts at 1:45. Yes. So as I have promised, so all of them, so our speakers are all-star speakers, so it continues. This panel is economy panel, but at the same time we deal with an economic security as well as international order. Actually, as you see your bio, the bio in the program, only one speaker is Japan specialist, but the theme of this symposium is Japan has huge implications for US relationship with China, as well as the world politics. And the first speaker is Eureka Sheda, who is teaching Japanese business at the University of California at San Diego. And she wrote a very interesting book that I assigned in my class in Japan. And the students really liked it. So she talks about commercial regime with Japan focused. And then the second speaker is Dr. Nin Lang, teaching at Georgetown University. She is a China expert of political economy of China. Her new book is coming out. Coming out in academic sense means that you will see it in a year or two. So, but it is coming. So, so she will talk about, but her recent research is about China's presence in Latin American countries, and she just flew in yesterday morning from Chile. And so she talks about China in developing countries, but more focusing on China's presence in Latin America. And the third speaker is Pat McDonald, who is a major researcher and then also leading political scientist of theory of liberalism in international relations. His book about commercial liberalism, which I use in my classroom, as well as the book that I'm writing. So he talks about how this commercial regime that is emerging with Japan at the center, or at least Japan is actually one of the center of the new commercial regime, and then implication for international order and international relations. And our discussant is my colleague Steph Recchia. Many of you may know, he's teaching international relations, especially security and military politics of military at SMU Political Science Department. And he will talk about, he keeps telling me that he knows nothing about Japan, but he knows about world politics. So he will be a moderator and discussant. Please join me for welcoming the panel.
Great, thank you. All right, well, it's after lunch and after a very riveting lunch talk, so I thought I'd bring you some pictures, and maybe it can be entertaining. So I'm Ulrike Schede from UC San Diego, and I'm the odd person out in this conference because I actually write books about, as Hiroki just said, about business. I'm a business scholar. I'm an industrial organization economist by training. I write books on the business reinvention of Japan, which has been translated into Japanese. And then I have a new book coming out. Actually, this is out last week, which I will bring out probably self-published. So in a couple of months as Japan reemerges. And so I want to make 3 points in my 15 minutes on U.S.-Japan business relations. The first is on Japan in general. Japan is critical for global commerce. And I will rub that in, that what we've heard over the last 10, 20 years about the Japanese economy is maybe half of the story, if that, and there is another story to be told, which I will try to do in 3 minutes. Second, Japan is critical for U.S. business, and there is something about sumo in here, which I may not have time to get into, but I'll go there a little bit. And third, I want to bring to you something you might want to chew on, namely that if they were decoupling, it would hurt the United States more than Japan. So I'll end on that. So let me start with Japan is important for global commerce. And so the question is, after 3 alleged lost decades where nothing happened in Japan other than bad news, how can it be that Japan is still the 3rd largest economy in the world? And, you know, Mireya, I mentioned last night, is now 4th, but that's an exchange rate thing, right? Japan trades at a 30% discount right now. So let's not get too worked up over this. But so the answer is the past 3 decades were not lost. something has happened. There were a period of transformation, and the leading Japanese companies are now re-emerging in a different shape and form, and the results are beginning to show now, as everybody who's looked at the stock market knows. That's not an aberration. That's just the stock market understanding that something is happening. Here's a much more interesting thing. That because the GDP you know, but this one you may not know. There's a thing called at Harvard called the Growth Lab, where they look at the technology strength of a country's exports. Right? So they take the exports and they say there are two aspects to it. One is how complex are these exports, and two, how many countries can make these exports. So a T-shirt is not complex. Many countries make it, low score. A semiconductor input material is very complex. Few companies make it, high score. This is the ranking. Japan has been #1, the most technologically complex export since over the last 30 years, which are supposedly, of course, allegedly lost and so on and so on. What's interesting about this chart, so Germany and Switzerland I don't show because otherwise you couldn't see anything at the top, right? So the top is Japan, Switzerland, Germany. South Korea is #4, and that's actually what Japanese business is worried most about. The United States has fallen to #12. Partially that's because we export a lot of rice, and that's great rice, and it's important for our export thing, but it doesn't count much here, right? So, but that doesn't mean it's bad. But China is up to 17 now. India's going sideways, and Vietnam is actually the big riser at the bottom, right? So this is interesting. So Japan matters for global commerce, not only because it's the third, fourth largest economy in the world, but because it operates at the technology frontier. It is shaping the technology frontier. Okay, so let me tell you how and why, right? And so I want to make my second point, which is Japan is critical for U.S. business. So I'm a business scholar, and this is how we like to draw the supply chain. And so everybody here in the room who has an MBA has seen this thing. What we do is we divide the stages of production of a given product into its various steps. In the old days, a company would do all of this in-house. Right? Then they would or source from co-located suppliers, Toyota and Aichi Prefecture and so forth. And then globalization, of course, means that the costs of logistics and so forth have fallen so far that it actually makes sense to buy some of these parts wherever the best and cheapest in the world, right? And so when we're talking about decoupling, we're asking, is this going back into one country, or is it going to stay sort of in, where it is right now? Overlaying this, the CEO of Acer, which is the Taiwanese computer company, in 1995 developed the concept of the smile curve, which is like this sort of thing, where he says, okay, where's the money in this? Right? Show me the money. And the money, he says, is in the smiley shape, which is that the design and input is where the money is, as is the logistics, which is why Apple is so brilliant. They design the iPhone in Cupertino, and then they make it somewhere else. They buy all the stuff around the world, and then they sell it to us in these glitzy Apple stores, right? And then that's where the money is. So how does Japan fit in? Japan used to be, of course, an assembler of televisions. It's a Sony, right? Of all kinds of electronics and blow dryer and toaster oven and all that. And when the CEO of Acer said there's no money in assembly, the Japanese companies in 1995 or so woke up and said, that's true. We can no longer make money in the assembly stage. We need to move. So we move either upstream or downstream. And so what's happened is what I call the Japan inside move, where the front runners, the leading Japanese companies, have moved out of assembly into making the materials that they then sell to South Korea and Taiwan, where they make the input part that is then sold to China, where they put the part together to sell it in our stores. Right? So that's sort of the Northeast Asian supply chain. All right, so Japan's transformation or reinvention that I call reinvention is the shift out of making consumer end products into making the much more technologically demanding input parts for those things, right? And we don't see that because there is no label on your phone that says Japan inside, or your car, or or anything in your household, anything that has a semiconductor in it, because there are certain stages of the production of semiconductors that only Japanese companies make. So, so there's a dependency here, and I could go there further, but let me just show you what that means. And this will look a little frightening, but no worries, I'll explain it. So, so that's my bubble chart. It's actually the Japanese government's METI's bubble chart. So what you see here at the bottom is the combined percent of Japanese market share in the world. And the lengthwise is the size of the market. So orange is cars. And we know that the car industry is a global trillion-dollar industry, and Japanese car manufacturers occupy 30% of that industry. It's almost 30%. They broke out the hybrids here. So the little orange bubbles are the Prius, you know, and that sort of thing. So, so Japanese car companies have 30% of the global automobile industry. I'm much more interested in this Milky Way on the lower right-hand side, 100% global market share. Right? And there are lots and lots of dots. And so these are like chemicals that go into the panel of the iPhone, or production equipment that make the chemicals that go into the panel for the iPhone. So you can go all the way upstream, right? And so in this METI research, they looked at 1,000 products, and they found that just on those 1,000 projects, they found that there are 500 where Japanese companies have a dominant global market share. That is, we need Japan to do something, right? Now you might think, well, wait a minute, why is this really special? Don't other countries have the same thing? This is South Korea. There's one bubble on the 100% line, and that's OLEDs. So this is super high definition television screen. That's it. Taiwan is a semiconductor manufacturer. We know that, right? So here it is. Right? The United States does, and pink, you might wonder, okay, so teal is a semiconductor, but with the United States still is the world's best semiconductor designer, right? Not manufacturer, but designer. And pink is biotech. And so we can have a whole conversation about why the United States is strong at this. Regulation has something to do with it. It's easier to do this in the United States, so that sort of thing. Of course, in this group, I would be amiss if I didn't show you China. And that is an interesting chart, because there's a lot of silver is other. So other could be cranes, maybe with modems on them, instead of, teal, like semiconductor or something. But if you look at the lower right-hand corner, there's not much at the 100% line. So China really is not quite there yet in terms of dominating input products that we need. Okay, so Japan rules this thing. So I call this the Mai no Umi strategy. Some of you may be seasoned enough to remember the old days of sumo, when everybody was really fat and big, like Konishiki and Akebono and these guys. But they weren't fat, they were just muscular, let's say. And my favorite, so this is in the 80s and 90s, my favorite sumo was a fellow named Mai no Umi. He was basically my height and, and 100 kilos. And he won against these big guys. And so what I see in Japan now is that the Japanese companies are becoming much more focused and athletic and quick and nimble, and do that play at these. Okay. Oh, and this is a recent phenomenon. So this is the reinvention. On the left-hand side, you see 2006 and then 2016. So it's clear that these bubbles have like sort of popped up suddenly, and that is the transformation. So the lost decade, you need to rethink. It's not a lost decade. It is a reinvention of Japanese companies as very important input makers. Okay, what does this mean in the context of this conference? And so imagine a worst case scenario. We heard the World War III might be the worst case scenario, but maybe on the way towards that, or even hopefully without a war, imagine a complete decoupling. The United States closes its borders. China closes its borders. Everybody closes their borders, right? We go back 100 years and, What that would mean is it is possible that with the exception of rare earth, which Japan does not have. So Japan does not have rare earth materials that you need to make a silicon wafer. Other than that, Japan is the only country in the world that can actually make a semiconductor all by itself, because it has 100% global market share in some of these input parts that are critical. The basic semiconductor other places can do, but I'm talking 5G, next generation, super advanced semiconductors. With the exception of rare earths, Japan can do this in domestically in the United States cannot, because the United States buys photoresist, which is the chemical needed for the masking, from Japan. And there are lots of other examples, right? So I can see here, so the dependency, right? So who's dependent on whom? And this is a very interesting situation that I just want to add one more point. I think I can do it. So I have a few more pictures. Number 3 point that I want to make, decoupling hurts the United States more than Japan, partially because of these dependencies, but for one other reason that I also want to point out in terms of working together and Japan's global production network, and how Japan actually is a much stronger economy than GDP numbers will ever suggest. So let me make that final point. Here is a chart of Fanuc, which is a robotics maker, where they operate on the globe. And the point here is everywhere. Right? There's hardly a country where Fanuc doesn't have an office. Toyota is more familiar to you. Of course, we're in Dallas, so Toyota has a global production network. And you may know, since it's your home turf, that the Japanese companies have sold more cars in the United States than American car makers sold last year. And the American car guys are employing more American workers or workers on American soil than Detroit. Right, so already Japan is here, and you may have known that, but let's think this through. What does that actually mean, right? And so more charts. This is a very complicated chart. What you see is that the curves are down. This is U.S.-Japan trade as a percentage of total trade, and all you need to know here, it's down, 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 right? So U.S. as a part of American trade, Japan as a part of U.S. trade. Maybe this is an easier chart. This is a percentage of the U.S. trade deficit by Japan, and it peaked in 1991, which is when we had these Boeki Masatsu, the U.S.-Japan trade frictions. By the way, never a war. That was the trade frictions. They were vitriolic, all right, but they were frictions. The thing that we currently have is China is a war, right? It's a trade war. It was very interesting linguistically, actually. So, then because of these trade frictions, Toyota and company opened up all of these plants in the United States. So there's a huge global production network. And I want to argue that we're underestimating what that means in terms of economic strength. I don't know why PowerPoint gave me a saving pick here, but I want to say, forget trade. I just wanted to wake you up after the lunch break. Forget trade. And Professor Solis, of course, is the ultimate trade political economist. But I want to ask Maria, don't take it too personally. Let's not totally forget trade, but let's look at something else. Instead, I want to look at foreign direct investment by Japan. And this is Japan's FDI outward flow to the United States. And you can see it looks like a sort of a fever chart of sort of up and down with the world crisis. So 1991, the bubble bursts, and then it goes up, and then comes the global financial crisis and goes down. On the right hand is the accumulated stock, right? So the stuff that Japan has in the United States, and it's up, 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 up. There's no down, right? Even through the global financial crisis. So, and this is an enormous accumulation of assets, and this replicates in other countries, in particular, of course, in Southeast Asia. All right, so up, up, up. I already said that. This is Japan's offices and manufacturing plants overseas over the last 40 years, and it is up, up, up as well. Again, including through all of these global financial shocks and whatnot, right? So Japan has quietly opened up a global production network. It's basically located in most important countries in the world, and for Japan, that includes, very importantly, Southeast Asia. These are net sales by Japanese overseas subsidiaries. It's an estimation. It's very difficult data to collect. But let me just tell you that Japan's GDP is $5 trillion, give or take. Depends on the exchange rate. But Japan's foreign sales over the last couple of years have been roughly 3 trillion and growing at a CAGR of 8%. That's where the Japanese economic growth is. So GDP numbers don't even begin to tell you the strength of the Japanese economy. Right? So let's not underestimate. So I guess I'm basically running out of time. There's one more chart I could show you about Southeast Asia, and let me just make this one point. I was sitting next to a senior person from a Japanese general trading company, and I said, well, this is a while ago. I said, it's said that Japanese businessmen, people are not very global in their mindset, and they're a little clumsy when they come to the United States, and they, they do their things differently and whatnot. Why is that? Why is there no more of a global mindset? And he says, well, we don't have a problem in Asia. We are not clumsy in Asia. We know how to do business in Vietnam. We know how to do business in Indonesia. When we go to the United States, it's a different environment. It's hard for us. But when the Americans come to Japan, they're also super clumsy. So let's not just say Japan cannot do global business. That's a culture thing, a whole different thing. Okay, let me conclude. Japan is a critical player in the global innovation frontier. Right? Japan no longer playing catch up. Japan is now a technology leader, and if I had more time, I'd show you that. The United States is a reliable. Japan is a reliable democratic partner that owns technologies that the United States needs. Sorry about the typo. And so the U.S. needs allies like Japan. And you know this already, but even at an economic level, without Japan, the U.S. economy is not going to work particularly well, right? And so it should worry the United States that Japan is worried about the United States. So thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Share your second slide one more time.
Oh, what did I do? My second slide, which one was that? My second slide. The books or the three main points? This one? Oh, the one with the complexity?
No.
This one, the GDP? No, I don't think so. It's not our second slides. Maybe this one?
Yeah.
All right, well, I can send it to you later if you'd like. All right, let me turn this back on here.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ning Ling, so I'm Assistant Professor of Political Science from Georgetown University. First of all, thank you very much, Hiroki and the Tower Center for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here. Oh, can you hear me? Okay, let me try. Let me hold it. All right, so I am a China person. I know nothing about Japan or global competition, but what I can offer you is to see the global South from the lens of China. So what I'm going to talk about today is how China views global South, what China wants from the global South, what is China's strategy, and how should the West respond to China in global South. So very briefly, first I would say, like any country probably, when China thinks about the global South, they think about political goals and they think about economic goals. I'll quickly go through the political goals for China in the global South. Politically, let's say there are two major concerns for China. The first one is China wants to increase its geopolitical influence in the global South. Part of it is political issues that we are all very familiar about, right? Support on China's stance on Taiwan, vote in the UN, et cetera, et cetera. What that means, interestingly, is China look at the global South, and the most cost-benefit efficient way is to engage with very small countries. So this explains, think about $100 million, right? That means a lot more in Nauru, for example, compared to $100 million in Argentina. So China's strategy engaging with the Pacific Islands, with the Central America, et cetera, can be explained by this approach to win over geopolitical influence. The second geopolitical concern for China is a very practical one to guarantee the security of China to its key trading route. So this is what the Chinese president has been since 2003 termed as a Malacca Strait dilemma. So Malacca Strait between Malaysia, Singapore, the strait covers 80% of China's oil import from Europe and the Middle East. 60% of China's trade in and out of Europe. But this area is controlled by US, India, and their allies. So China is very concerned about the Malacca Strait, and this explains China's engagement with the littoral states in Southeast Asia and South Asia. But this is not what I'm going to focus about. What I'm going to focus today about is China's economic pursuit with the global South. When it comes to economic goals for China in the global South, it wants several things. One, it wants energy, so oil, natural gas. Two, it wants natural resources, particularly, think about minerals and rare earth. And then third, it needs large markets for China's export. So this is very different from what China needs from the global North. From the global North, China no longer wants, needs energy, natural resources, it will be technology. So that's a difference. Global South means these three things. Now, with these goals in mind, let's look at the global South from China's lens. What does China see? So first thing, oil and natural gas, where does that come from for China? Primarily the Middle East and North Africa, and then Sub-Saharan Africa. These two regions together, 80% of it. And then natural gas primarily from Central Asia, 50% of China's natural gas comes from there. So, and after that, it will be Latin America. So that's the order of global South in terms of oil and natural gas. Now let's look at the global South from China's eyes in terms of minerals. So we're talking about copper, iron, lithium, etc., rare earth. Now, this is how it looks like. Most important region to China is Southeast Asia. Second important region is Latin America, and after that, Sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of agricultural products, so this is a third thing under natural resource that China needs. So China has a food security issue today. Its food dependency rate is 68%, which is really not that great. It's category 2 country. In the entire country of 3 categories, China is in the middle of self-sufficiency in food. So where does agricultural products come from? The most important region today for China is Latin America. After that will be South Asia, and after that will be Southeast Asia. And then the last, China needs markets. What are the important markets to China? This will mean large countries in terms of population and a solid, steady, rising middle class. So markets for China, they're looking at Southeast Asia again, Latin America, and South Asia. So this is the ranking of global South regions to China. Now let's try to predict what does that mean for China in the next 10 to 20 years? Which region is China going to focus on? To understand that, we have to understand what is going on domestically in China. And here are several important changes in Chinese economy in the past 10 years. Number one, we know the construction boom era is over, right? So real estate and the relevant sector. At the peak of China's economy, this sector, all of these construction related sector is 25% of China's total GDP. That boom is over. A lot of the sectors are disappearing in this economic sector. The second change in China's economy is the slowdown of export and therefore shutdown of many factories or products, particularly of lower added value. And then the third one is an attempt to then upgrade China's export portfolio. So Chinese companies are trying to climb up the value added chain. So they want to export electric vehicles, batteries, AI technology, etc., etc. And number four, again, there is a food security issue. So what does that mean with all of these change in mind is that China looks at global South and try to think, where can we sell these new products that we're trying to push? And what are we going to do with a decline in energy demand? So in the next 10 to 20 years, my personal prediction is the focus of China is going to gradually going away from Africa. The focus will stay strong in Southeast Asia, and they're going to have an increasing interest in Latin America, which matters for all of these new economic needs. So that being said, how is China going to reach all of this political and economic goals in the global South? So we know it's mainly through economic statecraft, right? So China doesn't provide security anywhere. In terms of soft power, China is rather behind. Let's just say, forget about companies, products, and movies, right? China doesn't have K-pop, but let's think about even for average population in the country, they want to go overseas for an education. Would China be among the top list? Still not there yet. So soft power in general, China itself considers itself pretty much behind to the West. So their most powerful tool is economic statecraft. So what does that mean? Basically, that will mean trade, which stays strong, loans and aid, and Chinese investment and Chinese projects. Now, the latter two, so giving out loans and giving out aid is very much entangled with China going out and doing investment and starting projects. So I'm going to talk about what they do in this realm, investment and projects. The first thing I would like to say is, so we are all familiar with Belt and Road Initiative. This is how China go out and do investment and projects. I would say 20 years have passed, and these projects are still very much welcomed by the global South. Surely there is a rising suspicion, right, about a lot of the Chinese projects in terms of security, environment, labor, et cetera, but these infrastructure, ranging from roads to ports to telecommunications, they remain a challenge to many of the developing countries. And it's particularly difficult for these developing country government to get financing for these projects. China not only comes in with projects, but all of the Chinese projects comes in with financing. So this is one of the most important advantages to Chinese investment. Also, there are several advantages of Chinese investments that is pretty unique. One, they are cheaper in general. Number two, when China goes out to invest, there's no political strings attached. So we're talking about China does not require changes in transparency, due diligence, good governance, etc. The usual toolkit come with Western investments. Chinese loans and investment are also dispersed very quickly, usually in 2 or 3 installments within a short period, much shorter, much quicker than investment coming from the West. And Chinese companies with their experience from China are very quick in their speed of construction. So these are all of the advantages of Chinese investment in projects abroad. Now, what is the disadvantage of Chinese investment projects abroad? One, even though they do not come with political strings attached, they do come with business strings. So we're all familiar with this. Chinese projects usually have requirements attached in using Chinese components, hiring Chinese companies, using Chinese labor. And so far, China has not had this practice of technology transfer into the host country. So these are the disadvantages of that. There are also environment and labor concerns associated with Chinese projects. And also, this is a new thing, Chinese banks start to charge higher interest rates for their loans and investment. Right now, if it's not a concessional loan, Chinese banks will charge about 6%. That's interest rate. IMF, by the way, to give you a benchmark, is usually around 4%. So Chinese loans are actually no longer that cheap, depending on the project. And this is due to China realizing 2 things. One, when you give out loans and investment without political strings attached, it's actually very valuable. So China realized that our money should come at a higher interest rate. And the second thing is 20 years building around the world, China started to realize there are a lot of financial risks attached to these projects that eventually might become a problem to China. So they're also becoming more careful, charging higher interest rate, etc. So these are the nature of Chinese main toolkit in the global South, economic investment, etc. So how should the West think about it? How should the West respond to the strategy of Chinese investment abroad? I think to answer that question first, we need to understand 2 things. One is whether these investment projects are in fact successful in terms of the project level itself. Are these good projects? The second thing is with China's increasing footprint in the global South, does China change public opinion towards, more favorable towards China? So let's try to answer these 2 questions. The first thing is, are these projects themselves successful? So unfortunately, when it comes to direct project level outcomes, revenues, profitability, your usual metrics, we don't have those data, not at all. So the best we can do is to see macro level data and how China is adjusting its investment behavior to try to understand what China thinks of its projects. So here I would recommend a data set, A data on Chinese projects by College of William and Mary, really great data source. So let's see where China's projects stand today in the global South. 80% of China's global loan portfolio now are in debt distressed countries. The total outstanding debt that China has accumulated in these 20 years of development is between 1.1 to 1.5 trillion US dollars. In 2000, so let's have a comparison with 2000. In 2000, let's say problem projects, meaning these projects might not ever recruit the cost, there were 17. And the total amount, monetary amount involved with these projects were 450 million. Now, 20 years later today, how many problem projects there are? 1,700, so 100-fold. And then what is the loan sum associated with this problem project today? It's no longer 450 million, it's $450 billion. So this is how much debt China has accumulated for itself. Now let's look at another metrics. In 2000, when China started building overseas, not a single Chinese project was canceled. All of them, saw through the project life cycle. Today, we count cumulatively a total of 94 Chinese projects were canceled, and their cumulative monetary amount is $56 billion. And so all of these data reflect a deep concern of the Chinese government today. That is, like, we're all familiar with this term debt trap, right? It's totally debatable. Are these actually debt traps when China gave out loans and investment projects? But today they're absolutely trapping China itself. It's a huge amount of debt. So what is China doing? By looking at what they're doing now, it also reflects a deep anxiety in the Chinese government. So first thing that it changed. China today is, in fact, not anymore focusing on building infrastructure. When we look at Chinese investment and loans, what do they go to in the global south? They, in fact, go to emergency lending or something called rescue loans. So what this means is a country is facing a default crisis. So Chinese banks go in and say, let me give you emergency loans so you can pay back what you owed us before. They focus on middle income countries that owe China already, and they're giving out a lot of emergency loans. So today, let's look at data again from A-Data, William and Mary. Only 31% of China's lending today goes to infrastructure, compared to back in 2008 at its peak. More than 90% of China's loans goes to infrastructure. China is no longer doing infrastructure. China is now a lender. It's not a builder anymore. It's giving money to global south. The second change in China's behavior today is that China is no longer using its policy banks to give out loans. Instead, it's increasingly resorting to work with other banks outside of China to fund its projects abroad. So 50% of China's lending today is via syndicates, bank conglomerates, consortium. And then of all of these 50% syndicate lending, there are over 80% of the banks involved are from outside of China, non-China financiers. So that's the second change. And then number three, this also reflects China's anxiety, is that China started to increasingly demand collateral. So back in 2000, only 19% of all of the Chinese investment projects abroad require collateral. Today, they require collateral for 72% of their investment projects. So all of these are reflecting a deep anxiety of China about its investment projects in the global south. It's no longer a very confident builder. It's becoming very careful in where to give its money to and how to lend out this money. So by the way, when we think about the debt issue, I think this is one of those new areas that we need to pay close attention to. And here I would, again, as a comparative politics person, I always think about international problems from a domestic perspective. So we know China accumulated between 1.1 to 1.5 trillion dollars of debt abroad, right? Is that a lot to China? So let's put this into benchmark. This number would amount to about 6% of China's GDP. Now let's think about domestic debt accumulated in China by China's local governments and local real estate developers. How much debt did they accumulate? 258% of China's GDP. In other words, domestic debt today is still a big issue, not the foreign debt. So why do we care about this comparison? Is when we try to predict what is China going to do with its debt issue internationally, we must remember that the real debt issue is domestic. So if China will forgive, loans and debt abroad, they need to think about domestic audience. If they don't do anything about domestic debt, no restructuring domestically, but they're doing it abroad, it's going to have very bad repercussion at home. So that is another way to think about the debt trap for China itself. So that's the first part of success. Is China very successful so far in its investment in infrastructure projects abroad? The evidence is not looking very good at this point. So let's look at the second dimension. Is China successful through the statecraft in impacting public opinion abroad? Let's think about elite opinion and public opinion, because these are actually very separate things. So in terms of what elite in the global south think about China, we don't have a lot of good survey evidence, etc., but we have, data and evidence here and there, including my own interviews and research. I think in general, elites in the global south are very pragmatic. So they think about Chinese money. They're not thinking about, shall we take China's money or America's money? They're thinking about, this is great. We're taking money from both. It's actually creating opportunity for a lot of the global south government. So in some sense, it gave them more options. They might even be more independent in crafting out their development trajectory and policies. So in terms of elites, very pragmatic. Hard to know what China's influence is. Public opinion, now the general public, we will say, look at all of these across the board, right, overview surveys, such as done by the Pew Center, etc. We will see, obviously, and there is no contestment here, favorability towards China has been dropping steadily with the 20 years of Chinese expansion in the global south. But if we want to look at surveys that are more concrete, for example, how do people feel about Chinese investment and Chinese projects? Now the evidence become a little mixed. Sometimes in some countries, you will see the public really applauding Chinese investment, but in other countries, people don't like them. And we look at the reasons why they do not prefer Chinese projects. It's mostly because of, again, human rights, environment, labor, land seizing, worry about natural resources, etc., etc. So we're running, me and my co-authors are doing a series of surveys on public opinion launching this May in Southeast Asia, South America, and Africa. Here's one interesting phenomenon that we noticed, and we will see when the final survey results are in. But in general, in the global south, if a country is experiencing democratic backsliding, in fact, approval rate for China will drop. So this is quite counterintuitive in whether China can influence countries with democratic backsliding or not. So we'll see what we find. Stay tuned. I'll end this more with a little bit just reflection on the West response. The West clearly has been pretty anxious about China's economic expansion in the global south, and they're trying to play catch up. So here's again data. DFC, so America's official development funding agency under US government, has increased their funding by 15 times in 2021 in response to China. 2021 alone, US gave out $60 billion to global south. G7 together for the first time outperformed China in 2021 and then gave out $84 billion to the global south. So there's clearly competition. There's also research to try to analyze how World Bank today gives out their loans and aid to developing countries. And this research showed that the World Bank has been trying to relax its lending conditions when it gives out to global south. So I think the question for the West to think about today is, if the West wants to compete with China in terms of economic statecraft, what is the approach to go? Like, do you compete exactly in the way as how China does things? Let's say race to the bottom, right? Let's see who gives out more, who gives out in what condition. Or can the West identify its comparative advantage and its niche to the global south and try to satisfy all of these infrastructure needs the global south doesn't have? So I just leave you with that question. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Pat McDonald. I teach at the University of Texas at Austin, and I want to thank Hiroki and the Tower Center for inviting me to give a talk today. And I'm going to preview my talk by saying I really like the view from 30,000 feet. That's kind of where my work focuses on, kind of broad trends in the international system and how do we understand them. And so the question that I'm going to try and address today, based partly but pushing back on my own work, is how might globalization in the contemporary era influence a shifting global political order that's marked by rising authoritarianism and U.S. decline? And to preview the takeaways, I want to make a couple transitions. First, I want to push us away from thinking about trade as a vehicle to foster peace between two states. Instead, think about trade and globalization as reinforcing coalitions and undermining coalitions among groups of states, or 3 or 4 states. And I want to think about this in the context of the post-1991 world and argue that globalization, in particular trade and immigration, have weakened the transnational coalition that was constructed after 1945 to stabilize global politics. But in order to do that, we need to rethink how we model international politics. I want to talk a lot about coalitions and not talk about states. And I want to talk about how you construct what we're going to think about as transnational coalitions, which include groups of domestic actors that are bonded and linked across states. And this is how we can understand the emergence of international cooperation and its breakdown. So we're going to talk about this in the context of both trade and immigration. And the deeper challenge here in the background of all this is how does the world adapt to an increasingly uncertain support from what has been its guarantor, the United States, since 1945. So briefly, the conventional wisdom, globalization as a vehicle for peace, the mechanisms associated with this are globalization fosters common interest among states, it reduces the incentives for territorial conquest, it facilitates domestic changes that embolden and strengthen internationalist groups that also support democratization. And my own work argues that it's not just trade, in particular, it's how we regulate commerce, the institutions of capitalism, trade liberalization, privatization that does the work. But, and here we'll start with the but, there's more to the story of trade and peace that gets lost in the macro picture and in the statistical analysis. The first thing to recognize, I think, really is the post-1945 emergence of this commercial peace is embedded within Cold War security politics. There's an exclusion from large portions of the world from this network of international trade. And so that raises the larger question of what's driving this. Is it the hierarchical security relationships created by the United States through its alliances? Or is it globalization, right? Is globalization a vehicle in the Cold War containment coalition to bind the coalition together, which already had common security interests? And the other thing that I think we need to recognize is the role played by the attempts to reestablish globalization in the mid to late 1920s. In particular, Barry Eichengreen's classical story about the Great Depression is one in which the reimposition and the attempt to recreate economic orthodoxy associated with the gold standard was fundamentally incompatible with the changing domestic orders that had emerged in the aftermath. And so what happens is the attempt to recreate globalization undermines domestic support for, at that time, the new political status quo that's associated with the Versailles Order. So how should we think about this in terms of understanding, step back, the larger question, how is globalization shaping the contemporary global order? I want to make another theoretical move here and say, let's not talk about states, let's think about coalitions. And coalitions are ubiquitous in international politics. First, let me define what coalitions are, and then I want to give you a bunch of examples, or at least how I think about them. What's a coalition? It's a cooperative political alignment in which its members share some set of common political interests. They coordinate the production of public or club goods. They possess some mechanisms to enforce cooperation within the coalition. Cooperation is frequently coordinated around an external focal point. What is that is intentionally excluded. Coalitions emerge by being against something else. I'm going to talk about this, tells us a lot about the success of the Trump revolution in the United States. And then coalitions differ in terms of their institutionalization, the investments that they make in enforcement capacity. So we see coalitions of states and alliances. States themselves are coalitions, institutionalized coalitions. We can think about empires and colonial systems as coalitions, political parties, and transnational movements like Bolshevism or Al-Qaeda. These things are ubiquitous in international politics. Again, I want to say that we should be studying coalitions rather than states and how states structure international politics. So what are some examples? If you've heard about the balance of power, that's about coalitional politics among great powers. If we think about the rise of authoritarianism, this is about concerns associated with an emerging coalition of authoritarian states. If we think about the bipartisan program of democratic enlargement in the United States after 1991, this is about constructing and organizing a coalition around shared values associated with democracy and democracy promotion. If we think about the post-1945 order, this is constructed around containment, containing the Soviet Union, and then institutionalized through the European Union, through NATO. through the United Nations, through the IMF, through the European Union. And we can also think about shifting domestic coalitions inside of the United States, rooted in increasingly parties, but also geography, regional, urban, rural distinctions, economics and ethnicity and race. When we have state centrism, or we have the blinders associated with state centrism, we tend to think about coalitions, two sets of coalitions, those between states and within states. And the argument I want to make today is we need to think about transnational coalition structures and interlocking. And so we need to think about how do we bind together parties or groups in the United States that have internationalist interests, the ones that are willing to make investments in the international status quo, and how do you bind them with other domestic groups around the world? One of the takeaways ultimately is globalization can be a vehicle to doing this, but there are also some costs associated with it. So why am I criticizing states? States themselves are institutionalized coalitions. In particular, they are designed to regulate coalition formation. How do they regulate coalition formation? Think about 2016, Russia and the United States. The institutions of sovereignty are designed to be organized around non-interference. These are a rule that external actors aren't supposed to participate in domestic coalitional politics within states. We see huge risks when these institutions break down, when states are incapable of preventing these transnational coalitions from emerging. And we can see this particularly in revolutionary transnational movements like Bolshevism and like Al-Qaeda. What's the threat posed to Europe? Beginning December of 1918 and January of 1919, why is it the Allies begin to have conversations with the German military at the same time as they're negotiating over Versailles? It's to contain the spread of Bolshevism, and it's to prevent the Soviets from supporting Bolshevik movements in each of the respective states. So states are institutionalized coalitions, but states are also national coalitions that allocate institutional power within them, and they help to reinforce the global political order by blocking extreme domestic groups. And this blocking occurs in both democracies and autocracies. And when we think about international stability, a central role played by states is to prevent radicals from hijacking the sources of power within the states, namely military apparatuses and administrations. So the global status quo, the argument that I want to make here is it rests on a series of interlocking transnational coalitions, which are composed of groups within states that coordinate and block extremists. That's how we constructed the post-1945 order. And I want to give you an example of what happens when this transnational coalition breaks down and the difficulties associated with sustaining it among democracies. And here we can think about Europe in the 1920s. The Versailles Order is constructed and organized around the ultimately post-1925, the integration of a democratic Germany. But the preservation of a democratic Germany relied on concessions from democratic United States, democratic Great Britain, and democratic France that propped up and sustained the new coalition that emerges in Germany post-1918, which is one of center-left, socialist, centrist Catholic parties, and center-right liberal parties. What happens over the course of the 1920s is this internationalist coalition in Germany that is committed to fulfillment and to Versailles is essentially weakened, in part because the democracies can't make concessions to Germany, increasingly post-1927, to stabilize their economy as the Great Depression comes on. And what then progressively happens is the whittling away of the centrist coalition in Germany that was central to maintaining the new stability. Does this sound familiar? Okay. If you're reading and watching what's going on in the Middle East, in particular in the last few months, you can see this type of analysis from how Tom Friedman is talking about the attempts by the Biden administration to construct a new peace settlement. And the strategy here is you get Israel to make concessions on a two-state solution. The US makes security guarantees to the Saudi regime. And then you allow trade and globalization to create this new network of ties between Israel and the Gulf states. Friedman is thinking in these terms. Who are the adversaries or who are the challenges here? For him, it's Netanyahu. and then it's Iran. And so this is a coalition that's designed to meet the challenges, organizing against Iran. But what Frieden is arguing is that we need concessions on the part of Netanyahu's government and can't get there. But again, the analysis is similar here. How do you construct this transnational network of coalitions that's staked and tied into the larger status quo? The other thing that I want to emphasize in all this is when we're talking about coalition analysis, and I mentioned it already, is the central role that excluded groups, intentionally excluded groups, play in providing a focal point around which to coordinate behavior within the coalition. Coalitions are organized against something. The post-1945 order was organized against the Soviet Union. If we think about the coalition that emerged, the global coalition that emerges post-2014 against ISIS. With this in mind, it's important to recognize, and here's a story for political leadership. Political entrepreneurs possess tremendous agenda-setting capacity to define that external focal point. And I think this is how we understand the Trump revolution and how the Trump movement is reshaping the Republican Party. We can understand the Trump movement as a reconstruction of the Republican coalition, essentially against many elements of liberal internationalism and globalization and the 1945 order. And he's raising a broader strategic question that's been in the background since post-1991. He's essentially challenging the role that US grand strategy has made Russia as the anti-device that you're organizing a coalition around, right? And he's essentially asking, why are we organizing a coalition against Russia? Why don't we organize it around some elements of liberal internationalism, multilateralism, extreme trade liberalization, and increasingly migration? All right, so let's talk a little bit about the post-1945 order, and then I'm going to move into thinking about globalization post-1991. So how can we understand the post-1945 order? It's institutionalized in the European Union, NATO, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Trade Organization. In democracies, who are the stakeholders? We have internationalist parties from the right and left, from the center left and the center right. I think it's important to recognize, we talked about this, containing radicals. And you can see this significantly in the US relationship with Germany in the 50s and the 60s. And there's if you want to read more about this, read the historian Mark Trachtenberg on this, that there's essentially a side deal between German leaders and American leaders because US troops are on the ground. West German politics are going to be governed in a series of blocking coalitions that deny both the communists and the reemergence of the far right. And if either one of these sides become part of the governing coalition, there was an expectation in Trachtenberg documents. There's an expectation of an military intervention by the part of the United States. This tells us something about coalitional politics. It's designed to support internationalist interests, right? But also then prevent the extremes from both sides. And it's important to recognize that we shouldn't think about states as internally constituted, right? There is active intervention and threats posed by external actors in sustaining that domestic equilibrium. What else does the Western coalition include? It includes authoritarian regimes on what we might think about as a political right. And it's designed and organized around an opposition to communism. It's important to recognize that this coalition is reinforced through globalization and through trade and economic incentives. And so we can think about this in terms of European and Japanese reconstruction after World War II. We can think about Marshall Plan aid as playing a central role in this. Think about this in terms of the GATT and the World Trade Organization. But we should also think about the trade liberalization done under the second Bush administration, right? Along these lines, there was an intentional use of free trade areas to build support. And the US expanded the number of free trade areas that it has from 2001 to 2008 significantly, but this was designed to cultivate the interest and support from local groups on the ground that would then tie themselves to the United States. But what's the but to all this? A lot of the relationship and a lot of the work, and this was talked about last night by Dr. Solis, in terms of how do we make globalization sustainable? It became sustainable at least through the early stages of the Cold War with what was called the embedded liberal compromises, a series of compensation mechanisms that were offered to the groups that were hurt by dislocation from globalization. But the rounds of liberalization post-1991 begin to erode some of these mechanisms of social safety support that are really kind of central to preserving globalization, and or at least minimizing the cost of dislocation associated with it. So what happens post-1991? And now I'm going to start to tell a story about coalition dissolution. We can think about the post-1991 shocks in terms of greater trade liberalization, but also the integration of two huge economies into the global economy, China and India, in terms of dramatically increasing broader sets of competitive pressures and putting new waves of pressures on labor in the United States in particular. And so we can tell a story about an emerging globalization backlash that's associated with trade liberalization and the price pressures associated with price convergence. This is a standard kind of trade theory story, which then helps to erode some domestic support for liberal internationalism on the left and the right, and work against the margins of this containment coalition that had been constructed in the first couple of decades of the Cold War. I think this is one way to understand the electoral battlegrounds and some key segments of voters in the United States in 2016. But it's not just trade, it's also immigration. And we need to think about the movement of people, not just in economic terms. It's a manifestation of globalization, but it presents a unique challenge to democracies in terms of it can activate and create expectations and concerns about a shift in institutional power inside democracies in terms of changing power at the ballot box. And we can see these challenges illustrated between the linkage between the border security bill and the Ukraine bill. So we can think about the Ukraine bill as a manifestation of the core issue facing the containment coalition or the anti-Russia coalition that dates back to 1945. We need to prop up Ukraine, get a lot more military aid so they continue the fight. What's it held up by in the United States? It's held up by the border bill, and it's still held up by the border bill. This is a story about immigration and the movement of people, and whether or not the United States can uphold its commitments originally made in the post-45 war associated with stabilizing this liberal international order. So where do we go from here? I think in terms of US interests, and it's been interesting to hear over the panels today in terms about the support that's emerging from Japan. I think in terms of US interests, I think I'm going to make an argument that the unilateral is futile in terms of catching up to the long run challenges. The US's strength lies in the institutionalization of its coalitions and the preservation of these coalitions. I think that the ability of the United States to defend its interest in the long run is going to depend on the preservation of these coalitions. But then the question is, all right, how do you leverage globalization to do that? I'm skeptical of broad-based macro liberalization instead, and I've been asking some of the panelists, how do we think about targeted liberalization that benefits groups in the United States at the margins of this internationalist coalition? How do you bring some of them back with targeted trade incentives? The other thing that I think we need to think about is immigration and restrictions on immigration. There's some new literature. I was talking about this with Professor Holofield last night on the embedded liberal compromise and restrictions on migration that emerged during the Cold War as a way to sustain some aspects of globalization. The US has to think about something like that today, in part as a political device to stabilize domestic support for its larger coalition, transnational coalition of interests. And then I think this is where I'm going to finish, I think this leads to a larger question about how do the advanced democracies begin to coordinate responses to the movements of people and migration, right? And so post-1945, it becomes a lot more difficult to move territorial boundaries, but globalization has reduced the cost of people to move. But when people move, you start changing the composition of interests within the states. what happens in the ballot box. And so the question is, how do you manage these transitions to stabilize them? And in the case of the United States, in the long run, preserve a bipartisan consensus in support of liberal internationalism. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So I won't take up much time. I'm sure you will have questions for our three distinguished panelists. I'd just like to kick off our conversation, maybe ask a question for each of the panelists, and I'll try to steer the conversation more back in the direction of U.S. foreign policy, which is what I study. I'm an international relations scholar, of course. So I'll start with our last presenter, Patrick McDonald, whose talk was, of course, explicitly focused on international relations, and he presented a very nuanced analysis. I haven't read the paper, so this is just based on the talk. I thought that for somebody who is known as a leading proponent of liberal internationalism, you sounded surprisingly realist in your when you talked about coalitions as focused against an external focal point. There seems to be nothing necessary in coalitions being against somebody, right? They can be focused on the promotion of internal collaboration or promotion of collective goods, etc. But I was going to ask you, the question that I have is, so you underscore the importance of US-led coalitions as underpinning the US global position, right? And so, and I take your historical analysis and the story that you tell, that's pretty compelling. But what about the present? If globalization is indeed in retreat and commercial internationalism is in retreat, can the United States support these coalitions based by relying on its security commitments alone, which is what I think we are increasingly witnessing both in relations with the Europeans and also in Asia. So that's, and then for Ulrike and Ning, also as exploring the implications for US policy a little more. So Ulrike, you presented a story of Japan re-emerging, right? Japanese corporations leading complex export sectors. Japan, in fact, dominating the market for some high-tech sectors, crucial sectors. So, and you alluded in your conclusion a little bit to how this matters for US-Japan and US relations and US foreign policy. But I'd like you to, if you could, I'd like to ask you to flesh out the implications a little more. So does this, for one possibility would be that US businesses would increasingly lose market share, right? And that this might give Japan leverage within the alliance, or are the supply chains sufficiently integrated that this can actually be a win-win game? And for the question for Ling also, I thought you presented a fascinating picture of China's efforts to gain influence in the global south, the developing world, right? And you divided this up in two goals: one to increase geopolitical influence, and the other to gain access to natural resources, oil, etc. And of course, the two are closely linked, as underscored by your analysis of lending policies and loans and the like. But again, how does this matter for the United States and its alliance structure? You talked a little bit about this. Is this necessarily a zero-sum game, or can China increase its trade and investments in the global south while the United States does the same? Does this necessarily have to be competitive, in our words? Thank you.
Let me go first. So a couple things. I guess this is partly more realist, right? And part of this is motivated. I think the tensions. This goes back to thinking about Schumpeter. Globalization and economic liberalization unleash the forces of creative destruction. And I think in the long run, I've always thought about the capacity for globalization to foster peace depends on making globalization sustainable and some levels of compensation. I think in terms of why do coalitions have to be organized this way, I'm thinking of this in terms of how do you construct superseding interests to solve the challenges associated with collective action. So yes, we can solve a public goods failure at home, but oftentimes the easiest way to do that is to pick an enemy, to construct a superseding interest and say, well, let's put these local distributional conflicts to the side and worry about the threat from outside. And I think increasingly politicians in the United States are getting a lot better at that in the last decade or so. In terms of the US and coalitions, one of the ways, or one of the, as I've been thinking about all the comments in the last day here, is that I am skeptical that the US can mobilize sufficient domestic support to leverage trade to cement the coalition. And so what that partly means is it needs coalition partners to shoulder some more of these economic costs, and where the US potentially has a role to play then is by reinforcing its security commitments. And so yes, I think it probably, the US needs to reinforce these to help get the allies to contribute in ways that its domestic political system isn't going to allow to today.
All right, so what does this mean for U.S. Japan or for U.S. foreign policy? I had prepared some remarks, and then I thought whatever I have to say would be preaching to the converted. You are here. That means you're interested. You know a lot about Asia. You can figure it, but let me say it nevertheless. So authoritarianism is bad for business because it increases uncertainty, and business people can deal with basically everything other than uncertainty, because they don't know what to do, right? And so as protectionism returns, I think that when the uncertainty around that increases, the business will withdraw and go home, and that is not good for anybody, including in particular the United States. I mean, the current Nippon Steel, U.S. Steel debacle is a great example where if somebody has to buy U.S. Steel. It peaked in 1964. It needs a white knight. If anybody were to buy U.S. Steel, let it please be Nippon Steel, because it is much better than any other suitor out there. But no, this is not so, because, and I think again, now I'm preaching the converted, that in the American public opinion, it's all the same. China's the same as Japan, it's the same as somebody else, it's all foreign danger. We need to close our borders, and so this is not even an indictment only of the U.S. education system. The high school students don't know this. I mean, there are people at very high echelons of our education system and in the public policy that think that Japan no longer matters. China, because the newspapers don't write about Japan, and so therefore, this is all bad. We all know that it has been promised that the 21st century will be the Asian century. And I think right now, what the US is doing in terms of its own foreign policy is making that happen. That if the United States is not careful, it will be left out of the Asian century, because within Asia, I could give a whole, I'm not going to do this, but I could give a whole thing about how the trade in Northeast Asia is actually pretty stable, and that it is very pragmatic around these input parts and whatnot. And so I'm quite concerned that the United States might do its own detriment, get itself out of this. That will change your story entirely, but we can't discuss it. You're no longer part of any village.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I didn't think there was a competition, or there should be a competition between the US and China in terms of compete on the trajectory of what China has been, how China has been engaging in global South. I don't think that should be the competition at all. And I was thinking that what US can do, here are several things that the United States have, but China does not. The advantage of US, one is technology, and second is sustainability. In how they conduct their business, how they, the kind of technology transfer they can offer to these global South countries, China cannot offer that. In terms of thinking about what is a sustainable way of production, China does not offer that either. So those are the strengths of the United States. And I think that's where they really should focus on. frankly, when we think about global South countries, right? Who would they rather work with? Usually American European companies are their top choice. It's just that these companies are really expensive, but that's a totally different, right? That's a totally different question on whether the US and Europe can become cheaper. That is a totally different domestic politics question. But I think the opportunity for the West to come about, like facing this issue of China, I think the opportunity comes into this debt restructuring window. So very quickly, a lot of the debt is going to mature. These are Chinese debt overseas, a lot of them. China is inexperienced in restructuring debt. It has never done that at home. It doesn't know how to do it internationally. So this is where United States and the Paris Club can come in and then actually help restructuring debt. So I think that should be the next focus.
Okay, we have another 15 minutes or so for your questions, so feel free to raise your hand, introduce yourself and ask the question.
So a question for Professor Leng. In Latin America, quite a few governments have elected left-wing populist sort of anti-neoliberal leaders. So if the USA and Europe decide to further invest in Latin America to sort of outcompete Chinese influence in the region, would you say that these governments might be detrimental to this effort from the United States, or that they would still accept this investment?
So I'm not an expert, so take this with a grain of salt. But my observation is a government being left or right does not predict their inclination towards China or the United States. I actually don't see that in data that we already have. I don't see that in my interviews. I think governments are usually very pragmatic. And left or right, right? A lot of them will see this competition between US and China totally good news for them. So that's how
I also have one for Professor Meng. With Chinese investments, as China continues to loan and do projects for developing states in the global south, what I believe we've seen is that if or when if they are unable to pay them back in money, does China just take control of ports or facilities in the state that they built? Like, do you believe that China's goals are perhaps to loan it, but if they don't get the funds back, do they just take control of the assets when they're unable to be paid back, like the ports or the energy facilities?
So that is what's commonly referred to as debt trap, right? And Sri Lanka is the one case that we have of what happened. And looking at Sri Lanka, China doesn't know what to do with that port. China did not really turn that port or the land. Okay, actually, I'm gonna say I have very limited information of what China does with that port, so I'm gonna take that back. But the issue is, I don't see, for most of these assets that China lend to, China doesn't have ownership. And for a lot of these properties that investment projects that went south, we look at what China does with them after, they, not many cases yet, they don't do anything. So it's very hard to know. It doesn't really benefit them. They want their money back. And this is why you see the rise of using collaterals, etc. You start to see with all of these leaked contracts of how China, does investment projects abroad, they're becoming more and more and more careful in their investment, which actually shows that they do worry about their money. They want to recoup the cost, is how I read it, for most of them anyways, most of the projects.
Any other question, John?
So I'd like to bring back Mireya's keynote speech yesterday, and then to Pat's coalition story. And so so when you talk about coalition, next question is when coalition is made, how sustainable is it? It is, right? So kind of institutionalization of coalition, and then where does it come from? And then So, and then, so my kind of hunch is it comes from economic interests, and then more specifically, like this is here, Eureka's story comes in, that is kind of business interest is a part of it. And then, so yesterday, we had Mireya speak her book, Japan's Quiet Leadership, and then why Japan now can exercise greater leadership role, although quietly, in the international politics. Well, one of the reasons is the change of the balance of power between the interest groups in the Japanese domestic politics, and then more business, more powerful, influential, because of the companies that Eureka talks about. So it's kind of, so Pat started with saying that he would talk about view from the 30,000 feet, and then I'm trying to like think about micro foundation of your story of the theoretical, your theory of coalition. I think that a domestic, so a coalition at the domestic politics level is changed, and then in that sense, like business and then also other interest groups are very important, and then like that will affect that will change the coalition, and then that will affect whether each country can play the leadership role. So that's actually my observation. Seeing compare, so try to bring like Pat, Eureka, and media together.
You want to?
I'll just throw you you know, kind of a volumes, you could put it over there. Authoritarianism, I mean, this is your title of this conference, right? So we want to come back to that. Is really bad for business. I mean, you get expropriation, you get state-owned companies having to do things, you get input, the business interest can actually be wiped out. And if we turn to a world where there are several authoritarian regimes, we want to forget about, I can retire or something. It'll be